The first thing I noticed as we approached the cave was the smell. It wasn't the usual earthy scent you get around limestone caves. This was acrid, metallic, almost like burning iron. I shrugged it off. Mike, our group leader, said it was probably just some mineral deposits reacting to the moisture. He had that confident way of talking that made you believe nothing could go wrong, and for a while, I did. We had planned the trip months in advance. Our group of 6 were all experienced cavers, or at least we liked to think so. There was Mike and me, of course, then Lisa, who had been with us on smaller expeditions, Tyler, a guy who thought he was invincible, Sarah, who was quiet but observant, and finally John, a freelance photographer obsessed with capturing raw nature. The cave was in the Appalachian region of West Virginia, deep in the Monongahela National Forest, a place known more for its hiking trails than its underground labyrinths. But the locals we'd spoken to hinted at a vast system of tunnels, some unexplored, and that was all the bait we needed. The entrance was narrow, just wide enough for one person at a time. We packed in, headlamps flickering, ropes and harnesses rattling against our gear. Immediately, the temperature dropped. It wasn't gradual, it was like stepping into another world. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a dampness that soaked through my clothes within minutes. The first 2 hours were uneventful, the usual tight squeezes, low crawls, and careful maneuvers over slick rock. The thrill was there, yes, but it wasn't until we reached the first chamber that things started to feel off. The chamber was huge, impossibly so, with stalactites hanging like jagged teeth from the ceiling. But what made my stomach knot wasn't the cave formations. It was the silence. Not the usual cave silence, which is still alive with the sound of dripping water or shifting stone, but a dead silence. It pressed against our ears, an oppressive, unnatural stillness that made every breath feel loud. We stopped to rest. Mike unrolled a map he had drawn from the sketches of the locals. "If we go left," he said, tracing a path with his finger, "we'll hit a narrow passage that opens up into the lower tunnels. From there we can explore the unexplored chambers." He sounded excited, but even he paused as a soft thud echoed through the chamber. One thud. Then another, faint, distant, but definitely coming from deeper within. We all froze. "Probably just a rock fall," Tyler said, though his voice sounded too loud in the silence. But it wasn't a rock fall. The thuds grew more regular, deliberate, like footsteps. Not human footsteps, not exactly. They were heavier, dragging somehow. We tried to shake it off and pressed on. The tunnel narrowed, forcing us to crawl on hands and knees. That's when John stopped and hissed for us to wait. He pointed to the walls. Scratches. Hundreds of them, etched deep into the limestone, spiraling upward in patterns that made no sense. "They look fresh," he whispered. I touched one and felt the sharp grooves. It wasn't just a surface scratch. Something with claws had gouged the rock. We pressed on, trying to convince ourselves it was just an animal. Maybe a bear, maybe something else. But as the hours dragged on, the passage seemed endless. Our headlamps illuminated jagged rock walls that seemed to close in, and the air grew warmer, almost humid, smelling faintly of iron now. And then we heard it, the whispering. At first, it was just a faint hiss, indistinguishable words. We all froze. Sarah's face was pale. She shook her head. "I hear it," she said softly. "It's saying something, calling." I strained to hear but couldn't make sense of it. The sound moved with us, echoing off the walls. Every time someone took a step, it seemed closer. Tyler laughed nervously and tried to make a joke, but the sound didn't leave. It followed, always followed. We reached another chamber, larger than the last, with a pool of black water in the center. Mike shone his headlamp across the surface, but the water reflected nothing. No ceiling, no walls, just black. That's when John froze. He pointed into the water. "There's something down there." We leaned over, and I almost wished I hadn't. The water rippled unnaturally, though there was no breeze, no disturbance. Shapes moved beneath the surface, dark shapes, long and twisted. I couldn't tell how many, but they were massive. Then they stopped. The whispering turned into a low growl, echoing around the chamber. We scrambled backward, but the exit was too far, and suddenly the air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing against our chests. Mike tried to lead us through another passage, but the tunnels seemed to twist, rearranging themselves. I swear the walls moved. Every turn led us back to the same chamber. Panic set in. Lisa dropped her pack, screaming. Something had brushed her arm, quick and cold. We all saw it, Shadowy forms at the edge of our lights, slithering along the walls, not animals, not bats. They were too deliberate, too fast, moving with intent. Sarah cried out, but there was no one to hear us. Only the whispering, growing louder, speaking in a language none of us knew, but instinctively understood as a warning. Leave or join us. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time lost all meaning. We tried to find the exit, but every tunnel looped back on itself. Our ropes and chalk marks were gone when we looked back, as if the cave itself was erasing our path. I could feel eyes watching from the dark, from the water, from the walls. Something was aware of us. Something was hungry. Tyler, ever the bravado, tried to charge forward, shouting for us to follow. He never made it more than a few feet. A shriek echoed from the tunnel he entered, high-pitched and inhuman. We ran toward the chamber with the water, hoping it was safer, hoping the cave would let us survive. That's when I saw it, a figure, humanoid but wrong, crawling out of the water. Its limbs were too long, its head twisted backward at an unnatural angle, and its eyes glowed faintly in our headlamps. It hissed and dove back into the water, leaving ripples that moved against the flow, spreading toward us. We huddled together, whispers now circling us, chanting, almost alive. Mike tried to organize us, tried to find another exit, but the cave had claimed him. I watched as he reached out for a narrow passage, and the walls closed in around him. 1 second he was there, and the next, nothing. Just a faint echo of his scream. John was crying, dropping his camera as he backed into the water's edge. He tried to film the shapes moving beneath the surface, but the camera malfunctioned instantly, lights flickering and dying. "It doesn't want to be seen," he whispered. Then we heard it, loud this time, a collective guttural scream from deep within the cave, shaking the walls. The water erupted, black shapes surging toward us. We fled blindly, crawling over jagged rock, hands raw, knees cut. The whispers followed, growing, circling, always behind us, but never catching up. Finally, I saw a narrow slit of light. An exit. I shouted, and we all scrambled, limbs dragging, lungs burning. As we burst into daylight, the air tasted sweet, normal. The sun was blinding, and for a moment, I believed we had escaped. But when I looked back, the cave entrance had changed. It was smaller, almost hidden, as if it had never been there. And I knew we had not left entirely. We made it back to our cars, but something had followed. None of us could sleep. None of us could speak of the experience without hearing those whispers. Mike's maps, the chalk, our equipment, all gone. We had no evidence that we had been there. And sometimes late at night, I hear a faint gurgling from the water in my dreams, and I know that the things we saw, they are still waiting in the darkness beneath the ground, patient, hungry, whispering our names. Story the end. I remember the first time we went caving as a group of college students in Kentucky back in the early spring. It was supposed to be an easy trip, a day adventure through one of the lesser-known caves in the Mammoth Cave region. We had the standard gear. Helmets, headlamps, gloves, ropes, a couple of walkie-talkies that were mostly useless underground, and backpacks stuffed with water and snacks. 5 of us went. Me, Jake, Lindsay, Mark, and Sarah. Looking back, I don't think any of us had any real understanding of what we were about to walk into. The entrance was deceptively calm, a low, jagged hole in the limestone cliff, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs, which made it look almost forgotten. We joked about how it looked like a rabbit hole and ducked inside. The first few 100 feet were easy. Wide corridors, gentle slopes, walls slick with moisture, and the occasional echo of dripping water. Lindsay kept snapping photos, and Mark kept trying to scare us with ghost stories about miners who never returned. I remember laughing, thinking how cliché it all was. Then we hit the first tight squeeze. The corridor narrowed, forcing us to slide sideways through a gap barely wider than our shoulders. That's when the first real sense of unease crept in. The air grew thick, the dripping water seemed louder, and the shadows cast by our headlamps danced in ways that made the walls look alive. Jake, usually the most confident, muttered that the air felt wrong, but we shrugged it off as claustrophobia talking. It got worse after the squeeze. We entered a chamber that opened into a natural vertical shaft, a drop of maybe 30 feet to a lower level. Mark went first, securing himself with the rope, then Lindsay, Sarah, and Jake. I was last. As I lowered myself down, my hand slipped on the wet rock. My heart jumped, and I felt a rush of cold fear I've never forgotten. I caught the rope just in time. I was shaking so badly I had trouble anchoring myself at the bottom. Mark muttered something about being careful, but his voice sounded far away, distorted. That's the moment the panic set in. We pushed deeper. The cave twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Some passages seemed to loop back to themselves, and every time we thought we recognized a landmark, it was gone. Our sense of direction was failing, and our headlamps illuminated only fragments of the walls, leaving shadows that suggested movement. We joked nervously, pretending we weren't scared, but we all felt it, the unmistakable pressure of being watched. Around the fourth chamber, the air changed. It became colder, damper, and smelled faintly of decay. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet, froze and whispered that she heard whispering. At first, we laughed it off, blaming the echoes. But then Jake stopped, his face pale under his helmet light, pointing at a dark corner where the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. There was a faint scraping sound, like fingernails on stone. We decided to turn back, but that's when the cave betrayed us. The passages we thought we had memorized seemed unfamiliar. The turns didn't match. It was as if the cave itself had shifted. Panic started to take hold. Lindsay tried to mark the walls with chalk, but every mark seemed to fade or get washed away by moisture. The more we tried to navigate, the deeper we got lost. The walls closed in, and every dripping echo sounded louder, faster, like footsteps behind us. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless underground. Our water was running low, and the temperature dropped drastically. Mark suggested splitting up, but the rest of us refused. Then the scraping came again, louder, closer, as if something was following. Shadows twisted at the edge of our lights. Sarah started hyperventilating, saying that she could see shapes moving in the darkness. But when we shined our headlamps, there was nothing there. At one point, Jake disappeared. 1 second he was behind me, the next he was gone. We called out, our voices echoing off the walls in agonizing delays, but there was no answer. Panic reached a breaking point. Lindsay and I started shaking. The others were silent, their faces tight with fear. Then we heard it, a deep, wet breathing coming from somewhere above us. It wasn't human. I don't think I've ever heard a sound so alien and threatening. We huddled together, trying to calm down, deciding to retrace our steps. Every path seemed wrong. The cave seemed alive. Walls that were solid before now had cracks that led to unknown darkness, and passages that were supposed to slope down suddenly inclined, making our compasses useless. Our walkie-talkies crackled with static, then a faint whisper that sounded like Jake's voice, calling us. But it was distorted, wrong, like it had been underwater. Hours, or maybe it was a full night, passed in that nightmare. We lost track of direction entirely. Hunger and exhaustion began to set in. Mark, the tough guy, started mumbling, not coherently, just numbers and nonsense. Shadows shifted in ways that weren't possible. Then, in one narrow tunnel, Lindsay screamed. There, pressed against the wall, were handprints, not ours, not from any human size, smeared with some dark substance. I touched it. It was sticky and warm. We kept moving, desperate. The further we went, the worse it got. The scraping, the breathing, the whispering, they all grew closer, faster. Every time we thought we saw an exit, it disappeared. We were trapped in a labyrinth of stone that seemed to mock our presence. Fear became a physical weight pressing down on our shoulders. By dawn, we were hallucinating. I could see Jake's face in the walls, twisted in terror. Lindsay started crying silently. Sarah whispered that she felt fingers brushing her hair. Mark was muttering to himself, staring at the walls as if seeing something only he could perceive. We were starving, exhausted, and utterly lost. Then we heard water rushing. At first, it was distant, but it grew louder, echoing through the tunnels. A flash of logic struck us. The cave had streams and pools we hadn't anticipated. Maybe we could follow the water. It had to lead somewhere. We stumbled toward the sound, slipping on slick rock, crawling through narrow gaps, following the faint flow. Hours of crawling later, we emerged into a vast chamber, lit faintly by a shaft of morning light filtering through a hole high above. Relief flooded us, but it was temporary. As we scrambled up to the opening, we saw him. Jake, hanging from the ceiling, unconscious, or worse. His harness had caught on a jagged outcrop. We rushed to cut him down. His skin was pale, lips blue, but he was alive, barely. We climbed out of that nightmare, sun hitting our faces, lungs filling with fresh air. We didn't talk much on the drive home. The cave had left its mark. I remember the quiet terror in Lindsay's eyes, the shaking hands of Sarah, Mark's silent muttering. Jake never spoke about what happened underground, and neither did any of us. We left the equipment in the garage, never caving again. Years later, I read a report about a caver who went missing in the Mammoth region. His description of the cave matched the area we explored. No one ever found him. Some people claimed it was just a misadventure in an unmapped cave. But I know better. Something in that cave hunts, something alive in the stone itself, something that makes the tunnels shift, the walls move, and the darkness itself breathe. Breathe. We weren't alone down there, and I don't think anyone who goes in will ever be. Story the end. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth as 5 friends crawled through the narrow entrance of the abandoned cave in southern West Virginia. Jason had heard rumors about the cave from a local outdoors forum, a supposedly forgotten system deep in the Appalachian hills where no one had ventured in decades. Adventure was the bait, and Jason's friends, Lena, Mark, Casey, and Ryan, couldn't resist. They packed ropes, helmets, headlamps, and basic caving gear, unaware that the darkness waiting inside was far more sinister than the natural confines of rock and soil. At first, the cave was almost normal. Narrow tunnels opened into small chambers with dripping stalactites, and the sound of their footsteps echoed against the walls. They joked, laughed, and took turns snapping photos. But as they moved deeper, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breaths became visible, curling in the dim circles of headlamp light. Mark whispered that it felt like the cave was alive, breathing alongside them. Everyone laughed it off nervously. After about an hour, they reached a chamber large enough to stand upright in, with jagged rocks protruding like broken teeth. Casey ran her fingers along the walls and stopped suddenly. "Guys, look at this," she said. On the wall were strange scratch marks, not natural cracks, but deliberate gouges. They looked old, dried with streaks of brownish residue. Probably some old mining, Jason suggested, though even he sounded uncertain. They pushed onward. The tunnels became narrower, forcing them to crouch and sometimes crawl. The sound of dripping water echoed unnatural, bouncing off unseen corners. Lena, who had been unusually quiet, finally whispered, "Does anyone else hear?" Whispering? The others froze, straining their ears. There was nothing but the occasional drip then, softly, like a voice carried through water, something that could have been words. They shook it off, convincing themselves it was their imagination. Hours passed, and the labyrinthine tunnels began to twist back on themselves. Jason's map was useless. The cave didn't follow any pattern. Panic started to creep in as they realized they had no idea which way led out. Their headlamps flickered intermittently, and the batteries in Casey's lamp ran low, forcing her to shield it with her hands. That's when they heard it again, the whispering, clearer this time, almost behind them. Lena grabbed Mark's arm. "We need to go back," she hissed. They retraced their steps, but every turn seemed wrong. The cave had changed, or perhaps they had. Narrow passages they were certain they had passed now ended in sheer walls. Sometimes the tunnels sloped in impossible ways, twisting as if mocking their sense of direction. Ryan's voice trembled as he admitted, "I don't think we're going the right way." They argued, fear fraying nerves, until suddenly the ground beneath Jason shifted. A section of rock gave way, plunging him into a small pit hidden beneath debris. He shouted as Lena and Casey leaned over the edge, trying to grab him. His hands scraped on sharp stones. "I'm okay! I'm okay!" he yelled, but his voice sounded strained and distant. They managed to pull him out, but the pit was filled with a sickly, stagnant water. Something glistened beneath the surface. Lena's stomach turned. It looked like bones, small, human-like bones, half buried in mud. They didn't speak of it aloud, but the realization settled in. People had been here before, and not all of them left. The tunnel narrowed further, forcing them into a crawl. That's when they heard it again, louder this time, a low, guttural humming. It seemed to come from inside the walls, vibrating through their bones. Mark tried to shine his flashlight down a side passage, and the beam caught something in the corner of his eye. A figure, hunched, unmoving. "Did you see that?" he whispered. No one answered. The figure was gone when they looked again. Panic overtook caution. They scrambled forward, hoping to find an exit, but the tunnels seemed endless. Hours blurred, hunger and thirst gnawed at them, and the cold seeped into their bones. Lena began muttering to herself, speaking in fragments that didn't make sense. Ryan tried to keep everyone calm, but the claustrophobia and exhaustion were relentless. It wasn't until Jason stumbled over a slick patch of mud that they realized something else was following them. Shuffling footsteps echoed theirs, but slower, deliberate, dragging. Every time they paused, the footsteps stopped too. Casey turned back once and caught a glimpse of movement in the darkness. A shadow, human-shaped but distorted, watching them. She screamed, and the others spun around, but nothing was there, only the echo of their own panicked breathing. They found themselves in a chamber that seemed impossibly large, the walls stretching high into darkness that their headlamps couldn't penetrate. The air was suffocating, heavy with the smell of rot. There, scattered across the floor, were more bones, some small, some large. Not old, but fresh enough that the marrow still gleamed faintly. Lena vomited, and the others huddled together, whispering frantic reassurances. Then the whispers became voices. Clear now. Low, guttural, chanting in a language none of them recognized. The sound seemed to come from every direction, and the shadows along the walls began to move. Figures emerged, thin, elongated, skin pale and wet, their faces hidden in darkness. They didn't speak, but the air thrummed with a malevolent presence. Mark tried to shine his light at one of the figures, and it darted closer, impossibly fast. He screamed, dropping the flashlight. The figure moved toward him with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the fear. Jason grabbed his arm and yanked him back, tripping over another set of bones. The others huddled, eyes wide, trembling. They realized they were not alone, and perhaps hadn't been for a long time. Desperation took over. They ran blindly, slipping on mud, scraping against jagged rock. The chanting grew louder, echoing, overlapping. The shadows followed, twisting around corners, always just behind them. Ryan shouted for them to stay together, but the tunnels were a maze, and in the chaos, they got separated. Jason found himself alone in a narrow passage. His lamp flickered, then went out. He was plunged into darkness so complete it felt like a living thing pressing in on him. Scrambling forward on hands and knees, he brushed against something slick. Fingers? No, hair. He recoiled, but the thing followed, brushing, coiling around him. He crawled faster, heart hammering, until he finally burst into a chamber bathed in faint natural light from an unseen surface above. He collapsed, gasping, and looked around. Bones littered the floor, more than he could count, and in the shadows he saw them all, his friends, or what remained. Lena's arm, broken at an impossible angle, stretched toward him. Casey's head, her eyes wide in silent terror, stared from a corner. Mark was crouched in the center, murmuring in that strange, guttural chant. Ryan was gone. The shadows pulsed, moving closer. Jason realized the truth too late. The cave didn't just hold the dead, it held something else, something that fed on fear and despair. The more he tried to run, the more the cave twisted, feeding the shadows, separating him from reality. He screamed, but the walls swallowed it, echoing it back 1,000 times until it was indistinguishable from the others. And then silence. The local search teams would later find the entrance undisturbed, with only a few scraps of gear washed in mud at the threshold. No signs of the 5 friends ever emerged. Locals avoided the cave entirely, whispering that it was cursed, that the walls themselves were hungry. The story of Jason and his friends became another cautionary tale, told to thrill and scare, but no one ever really believed it, except for those who heard the whispers at night, deep in the Appalachian forests. They say if you listen closely, you can hear it, the soft, guttural chanting echoing through the hills. And sometimes, if you get too close to the old entrance, the shadows reach out, hungry for company. Story the end. It started on a humid August morning in southern Missouri in the heart of the Ozarks. The sun was barely above the horizon, casting long shadows across the limestone hills, but the heat had already begun to creep through the dense forest. A group of 5 friends, Mark, Lisa, Tony, Sarah, and Ethan, had planned this trip for months. They were experienced cavers, although none had ventured into anything like Hollow Creek Cave, a vast, uncharted system that locals whispered about, but few dared to explore. The cave had a reputation. People entered, and sometimes they didn't come back the same way. The locals always said it was alive somehow, but no one could really explain what that meant. The entrance was hidden behind a tangle of briars, an inconspicuous crack in the hillside that looked like a faint mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Mark, the unofficial leader, checked their ropes, harnesses, and headlamps, the smell of wet earth and mildew thick in the air. Lisa adjusted her helmet nervously. Are we sure we want to do this? I've read some stories about this place. Missing people, weird sounds. Tony waved her off. Come on, it's just superstition. You think a cave cares who goes in? We're pros. We know what we're doing. Ethan, carrying the bulk of the gear, gave a thumbs up. Yeah, plus it'll make one hell of a story for our blog. The descent began easily enough. The first few hundred feet were wide and forgiving, with natural ledges and passages that let them move in relative comfort. They followed the map Ethan had pieced together from old survey notes, marking the path carefully with chalk and flagging tape. The air grew cooler, damper, and somehow heavier the deeper they went, each step echoing ominously against the rock walls. It wasn't long before the cave started to change. The tunnels narrowed into tight squeezes, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees. Water dripped constantly from jagged stalactites, forming small puddles that reflected their headlamps in fractured, ghostly light. At one point, Sarah paused, listening to a sound that made her stomach twist. It wasn't dripping water or the echo of their own movements. It was breathing. Faint, irregular, distant, but definitely human. Did you hear that? She whispered, her voice trembling. Mark shook his head. Probably just a draft or our own echoes. But as they pressed on, the sound grew closer, almost synchronized with their steps, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind. The tunnels themselves seemed to shift. They would take a passage that appeared familiar, and suddenly it opened into a section they hadn't mapped. Narrow, twisting corridors that defied the cave survey. Hours passed. Their headlamps began to flicker, batteries draining faster than expected. The constant dripping and echoing breathing gnawed at their nerves. Lisa was the first to break. I don't like this. I think we should turn back. Mark's voice was firm, but the unease was evident. We're almost to the main chamber, just a little further. They came upon a vast underground room, its ceiling lost in darkness above. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and the floor was slick with mud and shallow pools of water. Strange markings, like crude scratches, were etched into the walls. Some looked like numbers, others like symbols, others still like scratches made by clawed hands. Tony laughed nervously. Looks like some guy's been decorating. As they explored the chamber, the breathing returned. Closer now, unmistakable, circling them. They called out, but no response came. Suddenly, Ethan screamed. He had vanished into a shadowy corner of the chamber, and when the others ran toward him, he was standing, eyes wide, pointing at a tunnel that hadn't been there before. I don't know what it is, he stammered. Something's down there. Mark forced himself to stay calm. Stay together. Let's move slowly and mark our path. They entered the tunnel. It narrowed until they had to squeeze through on their stomachs. The air grew warmer, almost suffocating, smelling faintly of decay. Their lights flickered violently, and the breathing followed, now mixed with something else. A low, gurgling whisper that made the hair on their arms stand up. Then, without warning, the passage opened into a small cavern, and the floor dropped sharply. Ethan slipped, barely catching a ledge, but in doing so, he saw something that made him freeze. A figure crouched in the corner, too dark to see clearly, but unmistakably humanoid, staring at them. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. It didn't move, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Go! Mark yelled. They scrambled back, only to find the passage behind them had collapsed. Rocks and mud blocked the way, as if the cave itself had shifted. Panic set in. Lisa started sobbing. We're trapped. They tried to retrace their steps, but the tunnels were no longer the same. Passages twisted and looped impossibly, sometimes returning them to chambers they had just left, sometimes leading into new, uncharted darkness. Time became meaningless. Every attempt to backtrack seemed to fail. Then the whispers became voices, faint but intelligible. Leave. Stay. Come. They sounded human but distorted, like echoes of screams long dead. Shadows flitted at the edges of their vision, disappearing when they turned to look. Sarah tripped over something soft, and when she shone her light, she recoiled. It was a pile of clothes, scattered, worn, soaked in something dark. They were old, decades old maybe, but unmistakably human. The realization hit them like a punch. These were the remains of people who had gone before them. People who had vanished into Hollow Creek and never returned. Ethan's phone, which had somehow kept a faint signal, buzzed with a single notification: location lost. He threw it into the mud. Technology was useless here. Hours blurred together. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear clawed at them. Mark tried to keep them calm, rationing the small supply of water they had, marking walls to trace their path, but every mark seemed to vanish, wiped away by some unseen force. Then, as the cavern walls began to close in, they heard it, a scream, piercing and raw, coming from deep within the cave. Not one of them. Not yet. But it wasn't human, or if it was, it had been transformed into something else. Their hearts pounded. They stumbled upon a narrow, vertical shaft, barely wide enough for one person. Mark insisted they climb, reasoning it might lead to the surface. One by one, they began the ascent, hands raw from scraping against wet rock. When Lisa reached the top, she froze. Another passage opened before her, filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. Something lashed out. She screamed, and the others felt the force, though they couldn't see it clearly. Ethan was pulled back into the darkness. Sarah screamed, but Mark grabbed her just in time. They clung to the edges of the shaft, breathless and terrified. Hours, or maybe it was days, later, Mark and Sarah emerged into a narrow forested ravine, disoriented, battered, and alone. Hollow Creek Cave swallowed the rest of their friends, leaving behind only echoes. They stumbled for miles, delirious, until they were found by a pair of local hikers. No one believed their story. The cave had no record of the entrances they described. No maps matched their path. The search teams found nothing, and when Mark tried to point out the hidden entrance, it had vanished. The hillside was solid, unbroken. Mark and Sarah never went caving again. But sometimes in the dead of night, they hear the whispers in their dreams, and every so often, a hiker disappears in those hills, leaving only scratches on the rock walls and the faint echo of a scream. Hollow Creek is still alive, and it's still hungry. Story the end. Rain pounded against the windshield as Kyle drove his old pickup deeper into the Appalachian backroads. He and his friends, Derek, Megan, and Tara, were chasing the thrill of an unexplored cave system rumored to be miles from any main trail. Kyle had stumbled across it while hiking Forums, the description vague but chilling, a cave that had swallowed explorers whole. That only made it more enticing. By the time they parked, the storm had turned the dirt road into a slick, muddy mess. They geared up with helmets, flashlights, ropes, and minimal supplies, all the while laughing to mask the nerves creeping in. The entrance was almost hidden, a jagged scar in the mountainside partially obscured by overgrowth. It yawned like a dark mouth, and the first step inside was a plunge into cold, wet darkness. The tunnel smelled of wet stone and something else, something metallic and decayed. Their lights flickered as they descended, bouncing weakly off jagged walls. At first, it was just a simple crawl through tight spaces, the kind of caving Kyle had done before. But soon, the passages became narrower, forcing them to twist and squeeze in ways that made their muscles scream. Megan froze suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first, Kyle thought it was just the storm outside, but then a low, scraping sound echoed through the tunnel. Something was moving ahead of them. Something that didn't sound human. Derek scoffed nervously, probably just a raccoon or a bat. But the sound persisted, slow, deliberate, like claws dragging across stone. Hours in, they came to a cavern large enough to stand in. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, the floor slick with mud and small, sharp rocks. In the dim light, Tara noticed something etched into the walls, scratches, deep and jagged, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. They looked like symbols, but none of them could identify them. The deeper they went, the more frequent the scratches became, as if someone or something had marked the cave as their territory. Panic began to creep in when Kyle realized they had lost their bearings. The cave twisted impossibly, corridors leading back into themselves. Every turn seemed to bring them back to the same chamber, where the smell of rot was strongest. Megan's flashlight flickered and died, leaving them in near total darkness. They replaced the batteries, but the sense of being watched only grew heavier. Then came the whispering. At first, it was subtle, almost like the wind, but it quickly became clearer, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to crawl along the walls. Tara swore she heard her name. Derek laughed nervously, but it was hollow. They pressed on, following Kyle, But the cave itself seemed to shift around them, walls closing in, passages stretching farther than possible. It was Tara who first noticed the figures. Shadows, hunched and grotesque, flickered at the edge of their lights. At first, they thought it was tricks of the reflection, but the figures moved independently. Kyle tried to call out, but his voice seemed to vanish, swallowed by the cavern. Panic overtook reason, and they ran blindly, slipping on mud and rocks. Derek stumbled into a pit hidden beneath debris. He screamed as something cold and wet clutched at his ankle. Megan and Tara pulled him out, but when they looked down, the pit was full of human bones, blackened and slick with moisture. They froze, realizing the cave had claimed others before them. The whispers grew louder, forming words in a language none of them understood, punctuated by guttural laughter that echoed off the walls. They tried to climb a narrow shaft to escape, but the shadows followed, weaving through cracks and crevices, stretching impossibly long. The figures didn't run. They glided, stalking with patient malice. Megan screamed when one brushed past her shoulder, cold and clammy like dead flesh. Kyle swung his light wildly, catching only glimpses, pale, elongated limbs, faces hidden in darkness, eyes glowing faintly. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning. Exhausted, terrified, they stumbled into a cavern that seemed impossibly deep. Bones littered the floor, some fresh, some old, all in twisted positions. The air reeked of death. Derek sank to his knees, sobbing. "We shouldn't have come," he choked. The others whispered, trying to calm him, but there was no safety here, no exit. The cave was alive, feeding on their fear, and the shadows moved closer. Kyle realized with horror that they weren't just being hunted, they were being toyed with. The passages twisted around them, returning them to chambers they thought they had left, the shadows circling, always just out of reach. Megan's screams echoed and then cut off abruptly. Tara turned to find her gone, only the echo of movement and the whispering remaining. Desperation drove Kyle to run blindly. He slid down a narrow chute, landing in a cold, muddy pool. He scrambled out, gasping, and saw the others, or what was left of them. Derek crouched against the wall, muttering in the same guttural language that had haunted the cave. Megan and Tara were shadows, indistinct, reaching toward him with twisted hands. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices chanting in unison, pressing into his mind, stealing rational thought. He ran, but the cave seemed endless. Every tunnel led back to the same chamber of bones, the same stench, the same shadows. Exhausted, broken, Kyle realized the terrible truth. The cave was a trap. It did not allow escape. It fed on fear, despair, and life itself, growing hungrier with each new victim. By the time rescuers eventually arrived, following a faint signal Kyle had managed to send hours earlier, they found only the entrance and scattered gear. No footprints led out, no cries had ever reached the surface. The cave was silent again, but those who ventured near it afterwards swore they heard whispers carried on the wind, names being called softly, and sometimes the faint sound of running footsteps inside the mountain, always just beyond reach. Locals refused to go near it, muttering warnings about those who had vanished. They said the cave wasn't just a place in the mountain, it was a predator, patient, endless, hungry, and it was waiting. Story the end. The first time I heard about Hollow Creek Cave was from an old friend, Jared, who had a reputation for chasing adrenaline. He'd been caving all over Appalachia, always looking for the next hidden tunnel or untouched passage. He called me one humid September evening, excitement buzzing through the phone. "There's this cave nobody goes into anymore," he said. "Hollow Creek. They say people went in years ago and never came out." I was tired, but the kind of tired where your brain still aches for a thrill. I should have said no. I didn't. We drove the long, winding roads through West Virginia until we reached the forested ridge where the cave mouth was supposed to be. The entrance was smaller than we expected, a jagged black gap in the earth, half hidden by overgrowth. The air around it was unnaturally still, heavy with dampness and the scent of decay. We geared up, headlamps, ropes, gloves, food, and stepped into the darkness. The first few hundred feet were normal. Rock walls slick with moisture, water trickling from unseen cracks. We joked about ghost stories, but even our laughter sounded hollow, echoing off walls in ways that made my stomach turn. It didn't take long before things got weird. The walls started narrowing, forcing us to crouch and crawl. Our headlamps flickered and the air grew colder. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. just at the edge of hearing. Go back. Jared laughed it off, but I could see his face tighten. The whispers grew louder, almost like a chorus now, echoing off the walls. I tried to shake it off, but my skin was crawling. Hours passed. The passages twisted in ways that made no sense. Every turn seemed to loop back on itself. We marked the walls with chalk, but soon the marks disappeared, as if the walls themselves had swallowed them. It was impossible. We were moving, but the cave didn't want us to leave. That's when we found the first signs of others. Bones. Small at first, a finger, a rib, then larger ones, skulls staring with empty sockets. They weren't fresh, but the arrangement, it was deliberate. They formed patterns, almost like warnings carved in 3 dimensions. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Jared urged us forward, drawn deeper into the cave as if some invisible force was pulling him. The passage opened into a massive chamber. Water pooled on the floor, and stalactites hung from the ceiling like teeth. The whispering was deafening now, and shadows danced just beyond the reach of our lights. We stopped to rest, but neither of us could eat. The air was thick, metallic, and tasted of iron. Then I saw it. Something hunched in the corner, moving slowly, jerking unnaturally. It had no face, just a smooth, pale surface where one should be, and its limbs were too long and bending at impossible angles. My heart stopped. We ran. I don't remember how far, only that every passage seemed to change, twisting and folding around us. My headlamp died, leaving us in pitch darkness. The whispers turned to screaming, echoing from every direction, yet we couldn't tell if the sound was inside our heads or outside. Then came the hands, pale, clawed, impossibly strong, pulling at us, dragging us toward cracks and pits in the floor. I kicked and fought, but they were everywhere. Jared screamed, and I felt him ripped away, but I couldn't see him. I was alone. I wandered in the darkness for what felt like days. The walls seemed alive, moving, constricting, opening and closing like the mouth of some enormous beast. Every step forward led me deeper, never out. I tripped over bones, fell into cold water, scraped myself on jagged rocks. Exhaustion hit me like a hammer. Finally, I stumbled through a narrow opening and emerged on the forest floor, drenched, bleeding, shaking. Jared was gone. I ran until I found a road and flagged down a passing car. Police searched the cave the next day. Nothing. No tunnels, no bones, no markings. Just a dark, empty cave that looked harmless. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Hollow Creek is alive. It watches, waits, and traps. Some caves aren't just passages in the earth. They're hungry. They remember you. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind whistles through the trees, I hear the whispers again, calling me back. I don't sleep well. Every shadow, every creak of wood, every rustle in the wind reminds me there's something in Hollow Creek that still wants me. I can feel it, even now. Story the end. The summer air in Kentucky was thick and heavy, sticky with humidity, when a group of college friends decided to explore Devil's Hollow, a cave system whispered about in nearby towns. The group consisted of 4. Jake, the daring leader, Michelle, cautious but curious, Ryan, who loved to film everything, and Claire, quiet, thoughtful, the one most attuned to danger. Locals warned them to stay away, claiming people went in and never came back, but the thrill of discovery outweighed fear. They parked their truck on a narrow dirt road that ended at a tangle of overgrown bushes. Behind the vegetation, a dark slit in the limestone promised adventure. Their headlamps illuminated the entrance just enough to reveal jagged rocks and the faint smell of wet earth. Jake tightened his harness and grinned. This is it. Let's see what's inside. At first, the cave was almost welcoming. Stalactites hung like chandeliers, stalagmites rose like ancient guards, and shallow pools reflected their lights like mirrors. They moved carefully, marking the walls with chalk as they went. Ryan filmed constantly, the red recording light bobbing in the darkness. Michelle couldn't shake a growing unease, but the others laughed it off. As they ventured deeper, the tunnels narrowed, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees. The air grew colder, and a persistent drip, drip, drip echoed through the stone corridors. That's when they first heard it, a faint, uneven breathing somewhere ahead. They froze. Probably just an echo, Jake said, though his voice sounded less confident than usual. But the sound persisted, moving with them, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always just out of reach. They pressed on until they reached a cavern larger than anything they had imagined. The ceiling was lost in darkness. The walls etched with scratches, deep gouges as if someone or something had tried to escape. Michelle stumbled over a pile of bones. They were small, human-like, but brittle and yellowed with age. Claire's stomach turned. "These aren't old animals," she whispered. "These are people." Suddenly the air shifted. The breathing became louder, heavier, closer. Ryan swung his camera around, catching movement in the corner of the cavern, a shadow darting between stalagmites. The light caught a glimpse of glowing eyes before it vanished. Panic set in. Jake insisted they stick together, but the cave seemed to shift around them. Tunnels that should have led back to the entrance twisted impossibly, looping them back to the same chambers over and over. It was as if the cave itself had a mind, a malevolent awareness of their presence. Hours passed, maybe more. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at them. They tried to mark the paths, but the chalk lines seemed to disappear or lead to dead ends. The whispers started, low, urgent, unintelligible at first, then forming words, phrases that made their blood run cold. Stay. Join us. Never leave. Ryan was the first to scream. Something had grabbed his ankle, pulling him into the darkness. They couldn't see it, but they heard the scraping of claws on stone. Michelle lunged forward, barely catching his arm, but he was screaming, eyes wide with terror, shaking uncontrollably. When they pulled him back, a deep, guttural growl reverberated from the shadows, low and inhuman. They ran blindly through twisting corridors, the walls closing in, dripping water soaking them to the bone. The cave was no longer just stone and air. It felt alive, writhing, changing, closing passages behind them. They stumbled into a vertical shaft, a drop so steep it seemed impossible to climb, but it was their only hope. Jake went first, finding handholds in the slick rock. Michelle followed, then Claire. Ryan tried to follow, but something grabbed him again. This time a hand, pale, elongated, impossibly strong. His scream echoed down the shaft, chilling them to the core. Then silence. When they finally emerged into the light of the forest above, dawn was breaking. The world outside looked normal, almost peaceful, but the memory of the cave lingered. Ryan was gone, vanished without a trace, and no amount of searching revealed what had taken him. Back in town, they reported the incident. Locals frowned, muttering about Devil's Hollow, about the countless who had entered and never returned, but no one believed them fully. The cave's entrance had shifted again, blending seamlessly into the hillside. Jake, Michelle, and Claire never spoke of it in detail again. But at night, Michelle hears the whispers in her dreams. Jake feels the cold drag of unseen hands when he's alone, and Claire sometimes wakes to see shadows at the edge of her vision, watching, waiting, and every so often hikers disappear, leaving only faint echoes of screams and the faintest traces of claw marks in the rock. Devil's Hollow remains alive, patient, and hungry for the next explorers. Story the end. The sound of dripping water was the first thing I noticed when we entered the cave. It was steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, and it echoed endlessly off the jagged walls. My friends Jason and Lila were ahead of me, their headlamps cutting narrow beams through the darkness. I adjusted my gloves and tightened my helmet, the chill of the subterranean air sinking into my bones. We had been planning this trip for months, a weekend caving expedition in the Appalachian backcountry, but nothing could have prepared us for what waited beneath the surface. At first, the cave was deceptively easy. The tunnel widened and narrowed in turn, slick stone floors giving way to jagged boulders. We joked, laughed, and marveled at the formations. Stalactites hanging like daggers from the ceiling, stalagmites rising like broken teeth from the floor. But as we went deeper, the air grew heavier, humid and damp, clinging to our skin like a second layer. The dripping sound became louder, but now there was an undertone, soft, guttural, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Do you guys hear that?" I whispered. My voice sounded strange, muffled by the helmet. Jason shook his head. "Probably just the wind. Caves make weird noises, you know that." Lila, behind me, frowned. "I don't know. It doesn't sound like the wind." We pressed on. Eventually, the tunnel led into a chamber large enough to stand in. I could feel the humidity pressing on my lungs. The walls were slick with water, and the floor was uneven with loose rock. Our headlamps revealed an ancient-looking carving in the stone, something resembling a spiral with scratches radiating outward. I shivered, feeling unease creep up my spine. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the cave. Lila screamed. Something had moved. We spun our lights around, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the walls, a tall, thin shape with elongated limbs moving impossibly fast. What was that? I breathed. Jason laughed nervously, trying to ease the tension. Probably just a rock fall. Let's keep moving. We moved carefully, our footsteps echoing unnaturally, each one amplified by the cavernous walls. That's when the whispers started. Low, guttural, almost like someone speaking in a language I didn't recognize. They seemed to circle around us, rising and falling, getting louder every time we stopped. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. Guys, I don't like this, Lila said, her voice shaking. We continued, and the cave narrowed again into a tight crawl space. I felt a jagged stone scrape my knees and elbows as we moved forward. Jason went first, Lila behind him, and I brought up the rear. Then, without warning, a hand, cold, wet, impossibly strong, clamped down on my shoulder. I yelped and swung around, flashlight illuminating nothing. The air was thick, smelling of decay and something metallic. Did you feel that? I stammered. Lila's eyes widened. It touched me too. Something's here. The whispers intensified, now surrounding us completely. I realized they weren't coming from a single direction. They were inside my head. My pulse raced, my breathing ragged. We tried to backtrack, but the passage seemed to shift, twist in ways that defied logic. Walls we remembered a moment ago were gone. Passages led to dead ends. Panic set in. Jason tried to keep calm. Just keep moving. We'll find the main tunnel. Then we saw it. A figure, crouched on a boulder ahead of us. Its limbs were long and unnatural, joints bending in ways that should have been impossible. Its head turned toward us, and I swear its eyes glowed in the dim light. There was no mouth visible, yet the whispers became louder, more insistent, almost angry. We ran, crawling, slipping, and climbing over slick rock, the whispers chasing us like a physical presence. Every turn led to another dead end, another narrowing tunnel. The temperature dropped, my breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. I felt hands brushing against my back, against Lila's hair, something impossibly fast and cold. Finally, we reached a narrow vertical shaft. There was a rope dangling from above, left by some previous explorers. We scrambled up, hands raw and bleeding from the stone. The climb was exhausting, every movement burning our muscles. Behind us, the whispers grew faint, as if whatever had been following us didn't want to go into the shaft. At the top, we found ourselves in a small chamber with a rough exit leading to daylight. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. Jason was gone. 1 second he was climbing beside me, the next he wasn't. Lila screamed, peering over the edge of the shaft, but the drop was too deep. Only the faintest echo of his shout reached us. We climbed out, shivering, soaked, and bruised. The sun was setting, the sky a dull gray. We ran through the forest back to our car, our hearts still racing, our minds reeling. Rescue teams were called, but the cave was nearly impossible to navigate, and Jason was never found. Weeks later, I still hear whispers. Soft, cold, echoing in my mind when I'm alone. I know what we saw wasn't human, and I know it's still down there, waiting in the dark, moving just beyond the light, watching. Even now, I can't stop thinking about the last thing Jason said as he vanished. A wordless scream that sounded like it came from every shadow in that cave at once. Story the end. The autumn air was crisp, almost biting, as we parked at the trailhead near the Cumberland Plateau. My caving team, me, Lila, and Marcus, had been planning this trip for months. We weren't tourists. We were serious spelunkers, drawn to caves that were dangerous, remote, or largely unexplored. This system, locally called the Hollow Vein, had warnings plastered all over old forums, sudden collapses, flooding, and strange disappearances. I laughed off the rumors as superstition, but the uneasy feeling in my gut told me to stay cautious. The entrance was a jagged mouth in the cliffside, partly hidden behind a tangle of roots and moss. We geared up. Helmets, headlamps, ropes, and enough supplies for a day underground. The first stretch was familiar territory. Tight squeezes, low ceilings, and slick rock. Lila led the way, her headlamp casting shadows that danced along the walls, while Marcus brought up the rear, making sure we didn't lose each other in the twists and turns. 2 hours in, the cave narrowed into a crawl space barely wide enough for a person. I was in the middle when I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, so sharp it made my teeth chatter. My breath came out in visible puffs, even though it was October. Lila paused, her hand on the rock, staring ahead. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I froze. At first, I thought she meant the dripping water. But it wasn't water. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like someone breathing far ahead. We followed the passage until it opened into a large chamber. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, dripping steadily. The air smelled damp, but there was another smell layered beneath it. Iron, metallic and sharp, making me gag. Then we saw them. Scratches on the walls, crude symbols, circles with jagged lines running through them. They were fresh. The metal smell clung around them. Marcus's face went pale. These weren't here last year, he said, voice trembling. We pressed forward, deeper into uncharted territory. The chamber led to a vertical shaft, and old bolts hinted at previous explorers. Some were rotted, others bent unnaturally. As I tested one with my weight, a low, echoing hum reverberated through the rock. Lila froze. It's not the cave, she said, her voice barely audible. Something's down there. We descended cautiously. Halfway down, the humming coalesced into a whisper. Multiple voices, speaking in tones too low to be human, syllables I couldn't comprehend. The shadows along the walls seemed to twitch independently of our lights. I tried to rationalize it. Wind, water, echo. But deep down, I knew that was wrong. The air pressed against us, suffocating, almost sentient. At the bottom, the cave opened into an enormous cavern. Underground water flowed like a slow river, reflecting our headlamps in fractured patterns. And then we saw them. Small, pale figures darting between stalagmites. They weren't fully formed like humans. Elongated limbs, faceless heads, but they moved with intelligence. When they saw us, the whispering intensified, layering over itself until it became a constant, maddening drone. My stomach churned. I could feel it crawling under my skin, like invisible fingers brushing along my nerves. Lila screamed. One of the figures darted closer than the rest, too quick to see clearly. Marcus grabbed her, pulling her back, but we all knew we couldn't stay. The cavern seemed alive, shifting subtly as if it were a living organism. The walls themselves pulsed in the corner of my vision. We tried to climb out the way we came, but the passage seemed to have changed. The cave had shifted, closing behind us, narrowing in ways it hadn't before. Panic set in. Each step echoed loudly, making the whispers grow louder, sharper, almost accusatory. My hands bled from scraping the slick rock. Marcus slipped once, catching himself by a thread of rope, but the shadow figures moved closer, gliding over surfaces as though gravity didn't touch them. Finally, we spotted a faint glow from above, a narrow crevice, barely big enough, promising daylight. We scrambled through mud and dripping rock, barely keeping our balance. The whispering followed, now joined by shrill, high-pitched screeches. Lila lost her footing. Marcus grabbed her arm just in time, but we all knew we were lucky to have even that. Emerging from the cave, the sun hit us like a wall of heat. Birds called in the trees, ordinary and peaceful, a jarring contrast to what we had just left behind. We didn't speak, only moved. I didn't check my watch, I didn't gather gear. We drove away as fast as we could, leaving the entrance behind. That night, sleep was possible. Every shadow in my apartment seemed alive. The whispers followed me in dreams, faint at first, then louder, insistent, like the cave had followed us out. Marcus called the next day, voice hollow, and said he couldn't stop hearing them either. Lila hasn't spoken to me since, only sending brief messages that say, "Never go back." The Hollow Vein isn't on any tourist map. It's not a cave to explore for fun. And I know, even now, that what lives down there is waiting, patient, shaping the shadows for the next trespassers who think they're brave enough to walk into its mouth. Story the end. The morning was crisp, almost deceptively serene, as we loaded our gear into the back of my truck. I, Jake, had been caving for years, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited us in the limestone caverns tucked deep in West Virginia. My friends, Marcus, Emily, and Tony, were less experienced, but they were eager. The map we'd found online promised narrow passageways, underground rivers, and untouched chambers. What it didn't mention was the cave's history of disappearances. We hiked to the entrance as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The mouth of the cave yawned dark and unwelcoming, a black void framed by jagged stone. I led the way, helmet strapped, headlamp flickering, feeling a tingle of unease at the threshold. Marcus laughed nervously, shoving his backpack into place, but Emily lingered, glancing over her shoulder at the empty forest behind us. Tony didn't speak at all, just adjusted his gloves and followed silently. The first part of the cave was wide and deceptively easy. Stalactites hung like chandeliers, and the floor was slick with moisture. The echo of our voices bounced off the walls, making even our laughter sound hollow. After a while, the tunnel began to narrow. The rock walls were close enough to brush with our elbows, the air thick and cold. That's when I noticed something odd. Scratch marks on the walls, not from rocks or tools, but deep, claw-like gouges. Probably just some animal, Tony said, but his voice lacked conviction. We pressed on, deeper into the labyrinth. The light from our headlamps barely penetrated the darkness ahead, and the tunnels seemed to twist unnaturally. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, as though the cave itself was pressing down on us. Then Emily stopped suddenly, her hand pointing at a shadow across the tunnel. "I swear I saw someone," she whispered. We all froze, straining our eyes. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was the first time I noticed it. The subtle shifts of darkness around us, shadows that didn't belong to any of us, curling in and out of the corners. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. I lost track. The tunnel system seemed endless. Our map was useless. Every corridor looked the same. Every turn led to another dead end or a passage so narrow that we had to crawl. Hunger and exhaustion began to gnaw at us. That's when the noises started. It began with a faint dripping, then scraping sounds, then whispers. Low, guttural, unintelligible, but unmistakably voices. They weren't echoes of our own movements. They were separate, deliberate, surrounding us. Marcus joked to lighten the mood, but his laughter was hollow. We all felt it. The cave was alive. We came across a chamber with a pool of water, black as obsidian. Tony leaned over to touch it, and the moment his fingers broke the surface, ripples spread out unnaturally fast. Shadows moved beneath it, shapes that were too large, too fluid to be natural. Something was in the water, watching. Something was aware of us. Suddenly, the ground beneath Marcus gave way. He fell with a scream, and before we could reach him, a hand, or something like a hand, grabbed his ankle and dragged him into the shadows. I lunged after him, but it was too late. His scream echoed once, then nothing. Emily sobbed quietly, clutching my arm. "We have to get out," she said. I nodded, but the cave didn't seem willing to let us go. Every tunnel we tried led back to the same chamber. The whispers grew louder, and I could swear the shadows were moving independently of any light source, twisting and elongating like smoke. Panic set in. The walls themselves seemed to pulse as though breathing. Hours blurred into a disorienting nightmare. Tony and I were forced to crawl through narrow fissures to escape the shifting walls. Emily lagged behind, stumbling, crying, muttering about voices calling her name. At one point I saw something in the corner of my headlamp's glow. A figure crouched, pale, eyes reflecting the light, too tall and thin to be human. When I turned fully, it was gone. The cave seemed to play tricks on our minds, showing us visions of the lost, the trapped, and the dead. Faces pressed against stone, silent mouths open in screams, hands reaching from cracks in the walls. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into madness. Eventually, we found a vertical shaft with a rope anchored above. It seemed like salvation. I helped Emily up first, then Tony, and finally started climbing. Halfway up, the rope jerked violently. I looked down, shadows swirled at the bottom, coalescing into indistinct forms, eyes glinting, mouths opening in silent screams. I kicked, hit, clawed, but the shapes pulled with impossible strength. I screamed, and then the rope snapped. I woke in a small chamber, alone, bruised and soaked. Emily and Tony were gone. The whispers were back, soft now, almost friendly, coaxing me further. My headlamp flickered, and in the dim light I saw the walls moving, stretching, breathing. There was no exit, no map, no hope, only the cave, alive and patient, feeding on my fear. I write this now in the darkness, hoping someone, someday, might find this warning. Caves are not inert. They remember, they watch, and they hunger. And when the shadows whisper your name, they already know you belong to them. Story the end. It was mid-October, and the air in southern Tennessee had that sharp, biting chill that promised winter was coming. A small group of friends from my hiking club, me, Tyler, Rachel, Ben, and Emma, decided to explore an old, privately owned cave system called Hollow Creek Caverns. The cave was notorious among locals for being narrow, unmarked, and dangerous, but that only made it more enticing. We arrived late morning, our headlights cutting through the fog that clung to the forest. The entrance was a jagged opening beneath a steep limestone cliff, partially hidden by fallen leaves. The owner had warned us that the cave was unstable in places, and we had to be careful, but none of us expected what was waiting inside. The first stretch of the cave was deceptively easy, wide corridors with smooth walls, the occasional stalactite dangling like a frozen drop of water. We joked and took photos by laughing at how ridiculous the adventure seemed compared to our usual hikes. Emma, as usual, was a bit skittish, but she kept up. Then came the first tight passage. The ceiling dropped sharply, forcing us to crawl through a narrow gap. My headlamp reflected off wet stone, and I felt a shiver. Not from cold, but something else. The air became heavier, damp and musty, with a faint metallic tang. Something in the back of my mind told me to turn around, but curiosity pushed me forward. A few minutes in, Tyler stopped suddenly. He said he felt like the walls were watching. We all laughed nervously, but I noticed the way he scanned the shadows. Something was off. The cave seemed to change around us. Passages we had already passed looked unfamiliar. Every turn seemed slightly different, as if the cave itself was shifting. We pressed on. About an hour in, we entered a massive chamber. The ceiling was high, but the walls were slick with moisture. That's when it started. The scratching. At first it was faint, like a branch against rock, but then it grew louder, coming from deeper within the cave. Rachel froze, whispering that she could see shapes moving just beyond the reach of her headlamp. I squinted but saw nothing. The real panic began when we decided to turn back. Every passage we thought we knew led to dead ends. The cave felt endless, a labyrinth of stone that twisted impossibly. Our water was low, and the temperature dropped suddenly, chilling us to the bone. Ben, usually the most level-headed, started muttering about things in the walls, his voice trembling. Then we heard it, a low, guttural breathing coming from somewhere above us. It wasn't human. Emma screamed, pointing at a shadow that flickered unnaturally on the wall. We shined our lights toward it, and for a moment I thought I saw something crouched in a corner, something thin with elongated limbs and a head that tilted impossibly. When I blinked, it was gone. We stumbled blindly, each tunnel leading only to more tunnels, more dead ends. The cave seemed alive, every wall slick and shifting, every shadow moving in ways that defied reason. Rachel began to cry silently. Tyler whispered that he could hear whispers, names being called, our own voices distorted in the stone. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time had no meaning. The air was thick, the walls dripping constantly. We could hear footsteps behind us that didn't match our own. At one point, I turned and swore I saw Ben being pulled backward by something that disappeared when I reached for him. Panic consumed us, and we clung together, moving as quickly as the narrow passages would allow. Then in a wide cavern, we found water, a small underground stream. We followed it, hoping it would lead us out. The water was icy and rose quickly as we moved deeper. I felt the cave's weight pressing down, walls narrowing, ceilings dropping. Scratching and breathing grew louder, closer, echoing in the stone. Emma screamed as something brushed against her shoulder, but when we turned, nothing was there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw light. We saw light. A faint glow filtering from a high opening. Exhausted, soaked, and terrified, we climbed toward it. As we neared the exit, I looked back once and saw shapes. Dark, twisted silhouettes lining the walls of the cavern behind us, watching, waiting. We stumbled out into the cold morning air, shaking and silent. The forest around us looked calm, innocent, a stark contrast to the terror we'd endured. Rachel refused to look back. Emma was sobbing quietly. Ben kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting the shadows to follow. Tyler said nothing at all. We left our gear behind, not daring to look back at the cave we had entered. Months later, I read a story about a spelunker who disappeared in Hollow Creek Caverns. His body was never found. Locals whispered that the cave took people, shifting and twisting to trap those who entered. I knew it was true. Something in the darkness moves, something that waits for the curious, the brave, or the foolish. Hollow Creek isn't just a cave, it's alive. We never returned. None of us spoke about it again, but the memory of the scraping, the whispers, the impossibly twisting walls haunts me still, and sometimes in the quiet of the night I swear I can hear the faint sound of breathing, cold and wet, coming from the walls around me. Story the end. The beam of my headlamp sliced through the thick darkness, revealing walls of limestone slick with moisture. The cave had opened before us like an invitation and a warning all at once. My friends, Ethan, Carla, and Miguel, had been talking about this trip for months. A weekend underground in the Appalachians in a cave system few locals had ever dared to explore. No one could have predicted how wrong adventure could get. We started at the mouth of the cave in the late morning, the air already cool against our faces. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for two people side by side. As we crawled inside, the outside world disappeared. No birds, no wind, just the steady drip of water and our own breaths echoing off unseen walls. At first, everything was thrilling. We joked, took pictures, and marveled at the formations. Stalactites like chandeliers, stalagmites rising like frozen geysers. The cave seemed almost alive, breathing, whispering secrets. Miguel was the most experienced, having done smaller caving trips, and he led the way, careful but confident. After a few hours, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. I had to stop and wipe my sweat-streaked helmet, my light bouncing off the walls. There was a strange smell here, metallic and sharp, like iron. I mentioned it to the group, but they shrugged it off, blaming the minerals. But the smell lingered, and it set my nerves on edge. We decided to go deeper, following a narrow passage that curved sharply to the left. It got tight, claustrophobic. I could feel the cold rock pressing against my back, my helmet scraping along the ceiling. Then I heard it, a whisper. Not from any of my friends, not a word I recognized, just a sound human-like but wrong. "Did you hear that?" I hissed. They shook their heads. "Probably just the wind," Ethan said. But the wind didn't echo like that. It was deliberate, like someone, or something, was breathing just out of sight. We pressed on. That's when the first accident happened. Carla slipped on the wet stone, hitting her knee hard. A sharp cry echoed through the chamber. Miguel helped her up, but her leg was bruised badly. We debated turning back, but stubbornness or maybe ignorance kept us moving. We entered a vertical shaft next. Miguel rigged ropes, and one by one we climbed down. Halfway down, I looked up and noticed something on the walls. Scratches. Deep, uneven marks, not natural formations. I called Miguel over. "What do you think that is?" I asked, pointing. He frowned. "Probably bear claws, but that's not right. This part of the cave shouldn't have bears." Then we heard it again. That whisper followed by a scraping sound, closer this time. Miguel told us to stay calm, but his voice lacked conviction. My stomach twisted. I tried to focus on my own rope, my own descent, but the noises followed, echoing off the walls like shadows. We reached the bottom of the shaft, a low chamber filled with muddy water. I squelched through, slipping with every step, the whispers now more insistent. Then I realized they weren't random. The sounds were moving with us. The whispers shifted, circling as though something was following, keeping pace. Carla stopped, gripping her leg. "I think something's down here," she whispered, panic-stricken. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said, but his voice trembled. Even Miguel, the calm one, glanced around nervously. Then it happened. From the shadows, a shape moved. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't make a sound, but the air seemed to vibrate with its presence. I froze. Carla screamed, stumbling backward. Miguel shouted for us to move, but the creature didn't attack. At least not yet. It just watched, its form barely visible in the dim light. Then, in a moment of courage or stupidity, Ethan flicked his headlamp directly at it. The light revealed a gaunt, pale figure, its eyes black voids. Its mouth opened wide, not to scream, but to mimic ours. Every sound we made, it echoed back, twisted and distorted. I felt nausea hit me instantly. We ran. The water soaked our clothes, the mud pulling at our boots. The cave had changed. Passages that were familiar now twisted and led to nowhere. It was as if the cave itself had shifted. Panic overtook reason. The whispers followed, relentless, circling, mimicking us. Hours, or maybe minutes, time became meaningless. We crawled through tight tunnels, our hands raw from scraping the rock. Then we heard Carla's scream from behind. I turned, but a shadow blocked my view. Miguel grabbed me and pulled me forward. We couldn't stop. Finally, we found what we thought was an exit, a narrow shaft leading upward. We climbed, desperate. My arms burned, my legs shook, but the whispers below urged us faster. I thought we'd made it. But when we poked our heads out, the world above was wrong. The light was dim, gray, filtered through a fog that smelled of iron and rot. The forest outside looked twisted, trees gnarled like hands reaching down, and then I realized it wasn't the surface we had left behind. The cave hadn't released us. It had led us somewhere else, somewhere the shadows could move freely. Behind us, I heard footsteps. Not ours, something following. We scrambled blindly through the fog, running into trees that shouldn't exist, over ground that felt like stone yet moved beneath our feet. Carla screamed again, closer this time. We couldn't find her. Miguel shouted, but his voice seemed distant, swallowed by the fog. I ran, my lungs burning, until I saw a faint light. A cabin, maybe? I sprinted toward it, hoping it was civilization. I reached it and pounded on the door. Inside, nothing. Just darkness, furniture coated in dust, a strange warmth that smelled of iron and sweat. And then I saw it. Scratches on the walls, deep and jagged, surrounding symbols I didn't recognize, and beneath them, footprints. Not ours. Not human. I turned to leave, and the whispers returned, louder, closer, echoing off the walls, circling me, mocking me. The shadows moved. I ran into the fog again, never stopping. When I finally collapsed hours later, or maybe days, I have no sense of time, I was outside a forest that looked normal, the sun shining down, but something inside me had changed. I can't describe it fully. The cave had marked me, carved something into my mind. I made it back to town eventually. People didn't believe me. They thought we had gotten lost, that the cave had scared us into madness. They sent search parties, but nothing was found. Ethan, Miguel, Carla, they were gone. Just gone. As if the cave had swallowed them whole. I never went back. I can't. But sometimes at night, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again. I feel the cold walls pressing against me, the wet stones scraping my back, and I see the eyes in the darkness, black voids staring, always watching, always waiting for me to return. I know one thing with terrifying clarity. The cave didn't want us to leave. It doesn't let people go. And if I ever go back, I'll be next. Story the end. The sun was just setting over the rolling hills of West Virginia when a group of 6 friends arrived at the mouth of an abandoned cave known as Widow's Hollow. They had heard the warnings. Locals said people who ventured in never came back the same, if they came back at all. But the group, Tom, Lisa, David, Rachel, Mike, and Jenna, were thrill seekers, experienced spelunkers who laughed off ghost stories. They carried ropes, helmets, lanterns, and enough food for the day, convinced that nothing in the dark could scare them. The entrance was narrow, barely tall enough to walk through upright. Moss hung like curtains over jagged limestone, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. They shone their lights inside. The cavern seemed ordinary at first. Uneven floors, stalactites dripping water, faint echoes of their own voices. But even in the early moments, an uneasy feeling lingered, like the cave itself was observing. As they descended deeper, as the temperature dropped sharply, every breath was a visible puff of mist. Tom led the way, crawling through a tight tunnel that twisted sharply before opening into a vast chamber. The walls glistened as if wet, but there was no rain inside. Lisa noticed strange scratches etched into the stone, straight lines, jagged marks, not random at all. She pointed them out, but the others brushed it off as natural erosion. Hours into the exploration, they found a narrow vertical shaft leading further down. David went first, lowering himself with a rope. When he reached the bottom, he called up that it opened into a large passage, but there was a strange smell, sour, metallic, like iron. As the rest followed, Mike's lantern flickered violently, casting their shadows in grotesque, dancing forms on the walls. Rachel screamed suddenly. Everyone turned to see her pointing at the wall behind them. There were handprints, dozens of them, but impossibly small like a child's and pressed into the stone. Worse, some appeared wet, as though someone had left them moments ago. Jenna laughed nervously, trying to make light of it, but even she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. The group pushed forward, deeper and deeper, until they reached a narrow bridge of rock over a shallow chasm. Tom went first, testing each step. As he crossed, the ground beneath him shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if alive. When the others followed, the same subtle movement occurred. They reached the other side, but the sense of unease intensified. It was then that David noticed something moving in the shadows, a thin, dark figure darting just out of the light. At first, they thought it was their imagination. Then the scratching started. Soft at first, like fingernails over stone, it grew louder, echoing unnaturally through the chamber. It came from every direction at once. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, the rock shifting slightly with each thud. Panic set in. They tried to turn back, but the tunnel behind them had narrowed. What had been a wide passage was now barely a crawl space. Lisa tried to shout, but her voice was swallowed by the cavern. Mike went forward anyway, insisting there must be another exit. As they followed, the scratching became accompanied by whispers. Indecipherable, guttural, almost sentient, calling to them, luring them deeper. In a small side chamber, Jenna screamed again. She had slipped on the wet rock, and when she looked up, something was watching her from the shadows. Its eyes glinted faintly, black orbs reflecting their light. She scrambled back, only to find that the passage they had entered was gone, replaced by solid stone. The cave was changing, responding to them. Rachel was the next to vanish. One moment she was clinging to Tom, the next she was gone, swallowed by the darkness with a wet, choking sound. The rest called her name until their throats burned. The whispers grew louder, circling them now, pressing into their minds. Panic overtook rational thought. They tried climbing, crawling, squeezing through every passage, but the cave was a maze, impossible to navigate. Lights flickered and died. Their radios crackled with distorted voices that weren't human, repeating their names over and over. Cold water began seeping through cracks in the floor, rising slowly, threatening to trap them. Hours or days blurred together. Exhaustion and fear eroded their minds. Tom finally reached a chamber where the walls were polished smooth, black, and reflective like obsidian. In the reflection, he saw not himself, but something else. Twisted, emaciated figures behind him, with elongated limbs and eyes glinting with hunger. He spun around. Nothing was there, but the whispers and scratching were deafening. Mike screamed as the shadows seemed to pour out of the walls, merging with Rachel and Jenna's forms, though their faces were gone, replaced with smears of blackness. Tom realized the cave didn't just trap people, it consumed them, altered them, made them part of its dark interior. He tried to run, but the tunnel ended abruptly. He was alone. The last thing he felt was the cold, wet touch of something brushing his shoulder, followed by the whispers, "Stay, stay forever." His light went out. Complete darkness swallowed him, and the sound of wet scraping and faint, distorted laughter echoed endlessly. Outside, search teams would later find empty ropes and discarded helmets at Widow's Hollow, but no bodies. The cave remained silent, waiting patiently for the next group of thrill seekers, ready to claim them as it had claimed so many before. Story. The end. The first time I heard about the old coal mine outside of West Virginia, it was from a guy named Rick, a local who swore the place was haunted by something that doesn't die. He said he used to work there before it was shut down in the early 90s after a series of unexplained accidents. I was with a small group of friends, all amateur cavers and thrill seekers, and the idea of exploring a forgotten mine sounded irresistible. We drove down a dirt road that twisted through dense woods until we reached a rusted, half-collapsed entrance. The air smelled of mildew and earth, and a damp wind whispered through the opening, carrying a faint echo of something deeper inside. I felt my stomach tighten, but excitement overrode the fear. Rick had warned us, once you're in there, the mind doesn't like to let go. We entered with our headlamps cutting through the darkness. The mine tunnel was narrow, wooden supports creaking ominously above us. Every footstep echoed in the tight space, and the deeper we went, the heavier the air felt, thick with dust and an almost metallic scent. About 20 minutes in, we came across old mining equipment. A rusted cart tipped over, pickaxes embedded in the walls, abandoned helmets. Some had names scratched into them, dates ranging back decades. Rick's stories suddenly felt less like folklore. We followed the main tunnel for a while until it split into two narrow passages. I chose the left, driven by instinct, while my friend Casey went right. The tunnels twisted and turned, low ceilings forcing us to crawl, slick mud coating our boots. The mine seemed endless. Then the sound started. A faint scraping, soft at first, like a rock being dragged across stone. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Casey's voice came faintly from the other tunnel. "Yeah, probably rats." But I knew it wasn't rats. The sound was deliberate, moving closer, circling us. I kept moving, trying to convince myself it was just the mine settling. But then I saw the marks. Long scratches along the wooden supports, deep and fresh-looking. They weren't uniform, some clawed, some gouged, but all led deeper into the mine. My skin crawled. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the tunnel. It was Casey. It was a sound of pure terror, human yet distorted. I sprinted toward the sound, headlamp bobbing, heart hammering. The tunnel seemed longer than it should have been. When I rounded a corner, the walls were covered in scratches, words carved into the wood in jagged letters. Leave. Now. I shouted Casey's name. No response, only a wet, low breathing behind me. I spun around, shining my light into the darkness, and caught a glimpse of something moving. It was hunched, limbs too long, skin pale, and slick like it had been underground for decades. Its head jerked unnaturally, eyes black, reflecting the beam. Panic took over. I ran. The mine seemed to stretch endlessly, each passage twisting into another, disorienting. Every corner I turned, shadows moved just out of sight, and the scratching and breathing followed me relentlessly. My flashlight flickered, throwing the tunnel into near-total darkness. I tripped and fell into a small chamber, my light catching something on the floor. Bones. Human bones, old and brittle, scattered across the mud, some gnawed, some fresh. My stomach heaved. I heard a wet, gurgling hiss behind me and scrambled back to my feet. The creature, or whatever it was closer now, moving with impossible speed. I found a vertical shaft, a ventilation tunnel that led upward. I climbed, my hands raw from the stone, heart in my throat. Every so often I felt something brush against me, cold and wet. The breathing grew louder, echoing in the shaft. I reached the top, pushed through a small opening, and spilled into the night air outside. I gasped for breath, covered in mud and scratches. The mine entrance was silent, the wind still. Casey never emerged. We searched for hours, calling her name, but only the mine swallowed her cries. Local authorities were dismissive, claiming abandoned mines were dangerous and people get lost all the time. But I know what I saw. Weeks later, I returned, alone, trying to map the area, understand what had happened. The mine entrance was gone, covered by rock and debris as if it had never existed. The woods were still and quiet, but I could still smell that metallic tang in the air. At night, I dream of the mine, the endless tunnels, the scratches, the thing that moves in darkness, waiting. And sometimes, in my dreams, I hear Casey's screams. I've never gone caving again. I haven't spoken to Rick since, but the mine didn't let us go. It never will. Story the end. The narrow passage had been dark for what felt like hours. Every step kicked up a cloud of dust that caught in the beam of my headlamp. The cave smelled of damp rock and something older, fouler, something that wasn't just mold or stagnant water. My friends, Mark and Ellie, had been ahead of me, their voices echoing off the walls as they debated which passage to take. I hated the echoes. They made the place feel alive in a way that was wrong. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my voice bouncing back to me in distorted whispers. "Trust me," Mark said, though the hesitation in his tone betrayed him. "I've mapped this before. Should be a straight shot to the main chamber." Ellie laughed nervously. "Yeah, and straight to death, apparently," she said, trying to lighten the mood. But her laugh was hollow, bouncing back from the walls and fading too quickly. We had been caving in West Virginia for years, but this was our first real spelunking expedition together. Nothing about this cave had appeared on tourist maps. Local legends said the cavern had been sealed off decades ago after a miner disappeared, but we were young, reckless, and convinced those stories were exaggerations. The ground beneath me was uneven, slick with mud. My boots slipped, and I caught myself on a jagged rock. The sound of scraping echoed like nails on a chalkboard. Mark and Ellie froze ahead of me, their headlamps flicking around. I felt the tension spike in the air, as though the cave itself was holding its breath. "What is it?" I whispered. Mark didn't answer at first. He just gestured for us to keep moving, but then Ellie shined her light on the wall beside us. A handprint, faded brown with age, was smeared across the rock, impossibly high for any human. My stomach dropped. "Okay, that's not good," I muttered. Ellie swallowed. "Maybe it's just minor stuff, old stains?" But it didn't look like a stain. It looked like someone had pressed their hand there, maybe trying to climb, maybe trapped. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. The cave narrowed, forcing us to crawl on our hands and knees. I heard something, a scratching, faint at first, like claws on stone. I froze, listening. "Mark?" I whispered. "Do you hear that?" He shrugged. "It's probably just the rocks settling. Caves do that." But the scratching grew louder, and I could swear it was coming from somewhere above. from the ceiling itself. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but Ellie's sudden cry made me lose that thought entirely. "Did you feel that?" she shouted. Her hands were shaking as she pointed forward. Mark squinted ahead, and I followed his gaze. The ceiling above us wasn't just uneven, it was moving. Not in a breeze or a draft, but like something alive. A slow, deliberate shudder ran through the stone. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I stumbled backward, bumping into the wall. A rock dislodged, falling with a loud crash into the darkness below. The echo was terrifying. Something answered. A low, wet, guttural sound coming from deep within the cave. We froze. The sound came again, closer this time. Not an animal. Not a human. Something else. Something that had been here a long time, waiting. "Go back," I whispered. "We need to get out." Mark shook his head. "No, we're too deep. We can't turn back now. Not with the passages twisting like this." Ellie whimpered. Then we keep moving forward?" I nodded, though my hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip my flashlight. We continued, crawling through the mud, the strange noises following us like a predator circling its prey. Every shadow looked alive. Every drip of water sounded like footsteps. At some point, we came to a chamber so large it was almost cathedral-like. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth. The ground was slick with water that reflected our lights in nauseating, dancing patterns. And then I saw it. Marks on the walls, deep scratches that spiraled upward. Something had climbed here. Or someone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But we had to keep moving. We came across an old mining cart, rusted and abandoned. Inside, bones. Human bones. Some were broken. Some had been gnawed. My stomach churned and I looked away, but Ellie wasn't so quick. She gasped and pointed to a journal wedged under the cart. I picked it up with shaking hands. The pages were brittle, yellowed, scribbled notes, illegible in parts, but I made out fragments. "Hear them. In the walls. Can't escape. They move when we sleep. Take the others. I am next." Ellie dropped her flashlight, the light spinning wildly across the cavern walls. The shadows were moving. They weren't just echoes, they were alive. Shapes formed in the darkness, hunched, creeping. Too many legs, too many arms. Watching, waiting. "Run!" I screamed. We sprinted blindly, our boots slipping in the mud. The scratching and guttural growls multiplied behind us, chasing us. Every turn we took, the passages seemed to change. The cave itself was shifting, reshaping. It was no longer a cave, it was a trap. I grabbed Ellie's hand. Mark was ahead, shouting something I couldn't hear over the sound of our own panicked breathing. Then I heard it. Mark screaming. A sound I'll never forget. Like a human scream twisted through some monstrous filter, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I froze. Ellie pulled me forward. I couldn't look back. I heard wet, tearing sounds, the echo of a life being ripped apart. The shadows danced closer. I could feel them in the air, in my skin. We stumbled into another chamber, and for a moment I thought we had found an exit. Light spilled in from above, a faint, grayish glow. Relief surged through me. Then the ground beneath us shifted. A section of rock gave way. Ellie screamed as she fell into darkness, her hands slipping from mine. I tried to grab her, but she was gone. And in that moment I realized the cave had claimed her. And it wanted me too. I ran. I ran blindly, sliding through mud, scraping against walls. The sounds behind me were relentless. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. I finally saw a faint outline of daylight, the entrance we had come in through. My heart leapt. Freedom. I ran faster, lunging for the opening, but the cave wasn't finished. A hand, impossibly pale and long-fingered, shot out from the darkness, gripping my ankle. I screamed, kicking, pulling. Pain lanced through me. Somehow I tore free and scrambled into the light, collapsing outside, gasping, covered in mud and blood. Mark and Ellie weren't there. Only the echo of screams lingered in my mind. The rescue team later found nothing. No bodies, no tracks, just the cave, silent and indifferent, like it had never been disturbed. I never went caving again. I've read the stories, tried to rationalize what I saw. Some say it was hallucination, fear, exhaustion. But I know the truth. That cave is alive. It waits, it remembers, and it doesn't let go. Sometimes at night I can still hear it, scratching, shifting, just beyond the walls of my apartment, and I know it's patient, waiting for the next mistake. Story, the end. The air inside the cave was heavy with dampness and the faint metallic scent of minerals. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, drawn by the lure of unexplored tunnels deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I, Carter, had always been the cautious one, but the idea of a weekend caving adventure seemed harmless. Just a few hours underground, a thrill to chase, and memories to make. What we didn't anticipate was how quickly the thrill could turn into something that felt almost alive, something that watched us in the dark. We parked at the trailhead just after sunrise. The forest around us was dense, suffused with the smell of wet leaves and moss. Our guide, Tom, a wiry man with deep-set eyes and an unsettling calm, double-checked our gear: ropes, helmets, headlamps, and emergency packs. He warned us about loose rocks and narrow passages, about the claustrophobia that could set in, and the unforgiving cold underground. My friends, Mike and Lena, laughed nervously, brushing off the warnings. The entrance to the cave yawned like a black mouth in the side of the mountain. The sunlight didn't reach far, swallowed instantly by darkness. As soon as we stepped inside, the world changed. The air grew cooler, and every sound, our footsteps, the scraping of helmets against stone, seemed magnified. I felt it immediately, tension coiling tight in my chest. The first hour was exhilarating, stalactite-like jagged teeth, and the narrow tunnels twisted in ways that seemed impossible. We stopped often, our headlamps illuminating walls etched with strange formations. Lena pointed out one pattern that resembled a series of handprints, though faded and ancient, almost as if someone had pressed their palms against the rock in a ritual long forgotten. Hours passed, and the thrill faded into fatigue. That's when we noticed something wrong. Our path had split into multiple corridors, none of which matched the map Tom had drawn. Panic fluttered, but Tom assured us that the cave was notorious for confusing passages, and we needed to stay calm. As we pressed further, I started hearing faint sounds, almost like whispers bouncing off the walls. At first, I thought it was the echo of our own voices, but the whispers didn't match anything we had said. Mike and Lena shrugged it off, claiming it was just the wind or our imagination. I wanted to believe them, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was as if the cave itself was trying to speak, to warn or lure us. We came across a narrow chute, barely wide enough for one person at a time. Tom went first, his light cutting through the darkness. As I followed, I felt the rock beneath me give a small tremor that made my heart leap. That's when I noticed something. Scratches on the walls, jagged and erratic, as if something had clawed its way through the stone. I called out to Tom, but my voice seemed swallowed by the cavern. Then it happened. Lena screamed. I spun around, and there she was, pinned against the wall by something I couldn't see, her hands clawing at empty air. The light from her helmet flickered, casting shadows that danced wildly against the walls. I rushed to her, my fingers brushing hers, and suddenly it let go, dropping her to the floor. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she whispered one word, "It's here." Tom urged us onward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The whispers were back, louder now, surrounding us in a chorus of voices that seemed both human and inhuman. We tried to keep moving, but the cave seemed to stretch endlessly. Every turn led to another, every passage identical to the last. Our sense of direction disintegrated, replaced by a gnawing dread. We stumbled upon an underground stream, its water black as ink and impossibly cold. The sound of it rushing over rocks should have been comforting, but it only added to the horror. Shapes moved beneath the surface, fleeting glimpses that vanished when we blinked. Shadows in the water didn't match the contours of the rocks. Something in the depths was watching us, aware of every step, every breath. By now, fear had fully taken hold. Mike tried to rationalize, saying it was just fatigue and the cave playing tricks on us, but I knew it was something else. The air itself seemed alive, pressing against our skin, curling around us like a living thing. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but every path we took led to dead ends or tunnels that narrowed until passage was impossible. Hours, or maybe days, I lost track, passed. We ran low on water, and our headlamps began to dim. That's when I saw it, crouched on a ledge above us. A figure, humanoid but twisted, pale and slick with moisture, eyes reflecting our lights in a horrifying glow. It didn't move immediately, but the way it observed us was enough to freeze my blood. Its mouth opened, a gurgling, wet sound that wasn't quite a scream but wasn't silent either. We tried to retreat, but the cave seemed to shift around us. Every turn led us closer to it, as if it was hurting us. Lena fell, her ankle twisted on a rock, and I had to drag her. The figure followed silently, its presence undeniable, always just beyond the edge of our lights. Whispers filled our ears, and I began to hallucinate. Visions of people trapped in the rock, their faces pressed against stone walls, eyes wide and silent. Tom didn't speak anymore, just pressed forward with an almost robotic determination. I realized he wasn't leading us out. He was leading us deeper. The whispers told me as much. They spoke directly into my mind, and I understood then that the cave had no intention of letting us leave. It fed on fear, on despair, and now we were its prey. We reached a chamber that opened into a vast cavern. The ceiling was lost in darkness, and the floor was slick with moisture. Shapes moved in the shadows, countless figures that I could barely comprehend. They weren't entirely solid, yet they weren't entirely void. Eyes glittered like shards of glass, reflecting our panic. The whispers became deafening, and I understood. They weren't warnings. They were invitations. Something grabbed Mike from behind. 1 second he was beside me, and the next he was gone, pulled into the shadows with a sound that made my stomach churn. Lena screamed again, and I grabbed her hand, trying to run, but the cavern seemed endless. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but there was no exit. Only the shifting walls, the darkness, and the watching shapes. I realized then that time had no meaning here. Minutes could be hours, hours could be days. Our supplies were gone, our strength fading, and still the cave pressed on us, feeding on our panic. The whispers became voices I could not distinguish from my own thoughts, convincing me that leaving was impossible, that I had always belonged here. Finally, we collapsed near a pool of water, exhausted and trembling. Lena's breathing was shallow, her eyes wide with unspeakable terror. I held her, whispering that we had to stay calm, but I knew it was a lie. The cave had claimed us, body and soul. And then, in the dim light of the last working headlamp, I saw the truth. The cave was alive. The walls pulsed subtly, like a heartbeat. The shadows weren't shadows. They were extensions of it, creeping, stretching, waiting. It had watched us since the beginning, studied our fear, and now we were nothing more than food for its curiosity, our terror feeding its endless hunger. I don't know how long we stayed there. Hours? Days? I've stopped trying to count. The whispers have become my only companions, the shapes my only observers. Outside exists, I think, but I cannot reach it. We are trapped in a place that is not a place, in a cave that is not simply rock, a living, breathing nightmare. Sometimes I see a flicker of light at the far end of a tunnel. Hope surges, and I want to run, but I know better now. The cave will never let us go. It does not release what it has chosen, and it will continue to watch, continue to whisper, until we are nothing more than echoes pressed into stone. I write this in the faint hope that someone, someday, might understand. Caves are not just dark. They are patient. They are hungry. And if you hear whispers in the walls, do not ignore them. They are not wind, not echoes. They are the cave, and it knows you are afraid. Story the end. The night air was cold, but the smell of wet earth and limestone drew them in. 5 friends, Ethan, Claire, Mike, Sarah, and Josh, had been planning this for months. A weekend caving trip to explore Black Hollow, a remote cave system in the Appalachian foothills. Rumors of it being dangerous didn't scare them. If anything, it excited them. They drove up Friday evening, the headlights cutting through thick fog as they parked near the trailhead. A full moon tried to pierce the mist, but mostly failed, leaving the forest in muted shadows. Equipped with headlamps, ropes, and climbing gear, they hiked in under the moonlight, laughing at ghost stories and joking about cave monsters. Black Hollow's entrance loomed like a dark maw in the hillside, slick with condensation. Ethan, the most experienced caver of the group, led the way. His hand brushed the jagged edges of rock as he lowered himself into the opening. One by one, the others followed, the beams of their headlamps bouncing off wet stone and revealing sharp stalactites overhead. At first, it was everything they expected. Tight passages, dripping water, echoing footsteps. But deeper inside, the cave felt different. It was colder. The air grew thick, almost choking. They reached a chamber about the size of a living room with walls slick as ice. Mike ran his hands along the surface and frowned. "Feels wrong," he said, though no one took him seriously. They set up camp in the chamber, ropes anchored to natural rock formations, sleeping bags laid on uneven stone. Claire, restless, wandered toward a narrow tunnel off to the side. Her light revealed carvings etched into the walls, symbols none of them recognized. They weren't modern graffiti. They looked ancient, like some primitive warning. Guys, look at this," Claire called softly. Ethan came over, brushing away dust. His brows furrowed. "These aren't random marks. They're patterns. Maybe part of the original cave surveys, but weird ones. I've never seen anything like this in a mapped cave." They shrugged it off. They were thrill seekers. Curiosity always came first. By the next morning, they descended further into the cave, following a stream that twisted through the rock. The passages narrowed. At points they had to slide on their stomachs through dark, wet squeezes. The sounds of water dripping echoed in strange rhythms that made their headlamps flicker with shadows. It was Mike who first noticed something wasn't right. "Guys, I think we're going in circles," he said. Josh laughed nervously. "Caves do that sometimes. Look, the stream goes this way. We'll get somewhere eventually." Hours passed, but nothing familiar appeared. The tunnels seemed endless, folding back on themselves. The air grew damper, and a low, metallic smell began to fill their noses. Claire shivered. "I don't like this. It's like the cave is alive." Ethan's confidence faltered. "We'll be fine. Just keep moving. There's a main chamber ahead. I know it exists." That was when the sound started. First, a whispering, soft and distant, almost like the wind, but not quite. Then faint footsteps echoed behind them, though none of them had stopped. "Did anyone else hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The group stopped. Silence, thick and suffocating, pressed in from all sides. Then a slow, scraping noise reverberated off the walls. Something moved ahead of them, something too big to be a small animal. "Maybe a bear?" Mike suggested, though his voice cracked under his own fear. Ethan shook his head. "No, caves like this don't have bears inside. Stay close." They pressed on, hearts pounding. Every step felt heavier, the air thicker. Shadows danced unnaturally on the walls, distorted by the angles of the rock. Claire's light flickered and went out for a moment, and in that darkness she swore she saw a shape, a tall, humanoid figure crouched at the far end of the tunnel. "Guys," she whispered, but no one responded immediately. They were all staring, frozen. When her light came back on, there was nothing there. The fear began to seep in, slow and gnawing. Their path narrowed until they were forced to crawl through a horizontal shaft. Ethan went first, then Josh, then Mike. Sarah was last. Claire paused, peering ahead. She saw claw marks gouged into the rock walls, fresh ones, and drops of dark liquid smeared along the stone. Her stomach churned. Suddenly a scream echoed from behind. Sarah had been pulled backward into a dark alcove, her headlamp spinning wildly. The others rushed, but the tunnel was too narrow to help. By the time they forced themselves forward, Sarah was gone. Her screams were replaced by silence. "Sarah!" Claire screamed, panic ripping through her. Ethan tried to maintain control. "We keep moving. She's probably trapped further in. We can't stop. We'll get lost." Deeper into the cave, the passages twisted in impossible ways. The walls seemed to close in. The air grew colder, icy against their skin. Ethan noticed something that made his blood run cold. The carvings they had seen earlier were everywhere now, covering every inch of the walls. Symbols, spirals, shapes that seemed to shift when he looked away. Then came the voices. Whispers, soft and urgent, echoing from all directions. Some sounded human, others not. They spoke in fragmented phrases, as if calling their names. "Sarah, Claire, Ethan." Josh's flashlight flickered. This is not right. We need to go back." Ethan shook his head, realizing they had no idea which way was back. There is no back. This cave, it's changed. It doesn't want to let us out." A sudden, echoing shriek filled the chamber ahead. Something moved, a shadowy figure, enormous, with limbs that bent wrong, crouched over what looked like bones. Claire felt bile rise in her throat. She turned to scream, but nothing came out. Mike grabbed her arm. "Run!" They scrambled through a maze of tunnels, the cave itself seeming to twist against them. Every passage led to another, yet never the same as the one before. Ethan fell, scraping his hands along the walls, leaving streaks of blood. He heard Josh behind him cry out, then silence. Time lost meaning. They crawled, climbed, slid. At some point, Claire realized she was alone with Ethan. The whispers had grown louder, forming words she could almost understand. "Stay. Forever. Join us." Then the ground beneath her shifted. A hidden pit yawned open and she fell, tumbling down a shaft, scraping her arms and legs. When she landed, the darkness pressed on her from all sides. Ethan's voice called out faintly, but each shout seemed distant, echoing from somewhere else entirely. Claire limped through the darkness, headlamp still flickering. She found herself in a vast chamber, walls slick with water, bones scattered across the floor, human, animal, unidentifiable. The air was thick with decay. She realized with horror that some of the bones were fresh. Movement at the far end caught her eye. The shadow from before, the thing with impossible limbs, now slowly advancing. She turned and ran, screaming, twisting through tunnels that led nowhere. Hours, or maybe days, passed. Time became meaningless. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion gnawed at her. The whispers never stopped. At some point, she could feel them crawling on her skin, in her ears, in her mind. Then, as suddenly as it started, the cave opened into a small shaft of light. Claire crawled through, barely able to move, and emerged into the cold night air. She stumbled into the trees, collapsing near their abandoned car. The forest was silent, the fog rolling past like nothing had happened, but she was alone. Ethan, Mike, Josh, Sarah, gone. The cave behind her remained dark, silent, impenetrable. She ran, screaming, until the trees thinned and she found a road. She flagged down a passing car, her voice raw, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Authorities searched Black Hollow for weeks. Nothing. No signs of the missing Cavers, no trace of the pit Claire had fallen through, no explanation for the symbols, no signs of the shadowy figures. Local legends warned of the cave, stories of people entering and never returning, but no one believed them. Until Claire. Even now, she hears the whispers when it rains or when she closes her eyes. The shapes from Black Hollow haunt her dreams, reaching for her from the darkness, reminding her that some caves are not just tunnels through rock. They are living things, hungry, patient, and eternal. And somewhere deep beneath the Appalachian hills, Black Hollow waits for its next visitors, ready to claim them forever. Story the end. The air in the cave was thick with dust and moisture, a heavy dampness that clung to my clothes and skin. I could hear the faint drip of water echoing from deep within, irregular yet constant, like the slow, steady pulse of something alive. My friends, Derek and Megan, were ahead of me, their headlamps bobbing and casting long, trembling shadows on the jagged walls. We had been caving for hours, deeper into the Appalachian limestone than any of us had been before. The map we had was old, barely legible, and the cave itself was rumored to be treacherous, with tight squeezes and sudden drop-offs. But none of that mattered. We were thrill seekers, and this was supposed to be the ultimate adventure. We reached a narrow passage, barely wider than my shoulders. I squeezed through, my chest brushing against cold, wet rock, feeling the rough surface graze my skin. Derek was on the other side, waiting, his flashlight illuminating the way forward. "Hurry up," he whispered, his voice bouncing eerily off the walls. Megan was crawling behind me, her small frame surprisingly adept at moving through the cramped spaces. As I followed Derek, the cave began to open into a larger chamber. The ceiling was low, but the walls stretched out, slick with moisture, and I could hear the sound of something moving in the distance. Something that wasn't us. I froze, listening. Derek and Megan didn't seem to notice. Probably just the wind. Derek said when I voiced my concern, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate movement, scraping across rock. We continued, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every step echoed unnaturally, bouncing back with a delay that made it hard to tell which sounds were ours. The air grew colder, and the dripping water turned into a steady trickle. Megan shivered. "Guys, I don't like this," she said, her voice trembling. I tried to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. We reached a section of the cave that the map didn't mark, a vertical drop with a rope dangling into the darkness below. Derek looked at it, grinning. "Looks like a free climb," he said. He started descending first, and Megan followed hesitantly. I grabbed the rope, my gloves slippery with water, and started down. The darkness below swallowed the light, and I felt a sense of vertigo like I was falling into nothing. Halfway down, I heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, coming from somewhere below me. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Derek?" I called, my voice cracking. Only silence answered, and then the whisper again, this time closer. I froze, my hands tightening around the rope. Megan's voice came from above, faint and terrified. "Did you hear that?" I kept descending, forcing myself to move. The bottom of the drop opened into a cavern I hadn't seen on the map. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, and the ground was uneven, littered with broken rock and debris. But the sound, the whispering, was louder here, circling around us. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a series of hisses and groans, almost like a chant. Derek was crouched near a narrow tunnel leading further into the cave. "Let's see what's down there," he said. I wanted to argue, wanted to turn back, but curiosity mixed with fear held me frozen in place. Megan clung to my arm. "Please, let's just go back," she begged. That's when I saw it. A figure moving in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our lights. At first, I thought it was Derek playing a joke, but the thing didn't resemble any human I'd ever seen. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet with snapped strings. Its face was obscured by darkness, but the sense of being watched, hunted, hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back, and my flashlight flickered. "Did you see that?" I whispered, panicked. Derek laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but then Megan screamed. The figure, or whatever it was, had appeared behind her, only a few feet away. It moved faster than anything human, and in that instant I understood. We weren't alone in this cave. We ran. The tunnel twisted and turned, and every step seemed to echo endlessly, masking the sounds behind us. The whispers grew louder, almost mocking, and I could feel it stalking us. I tried not to think about what might happen if it caught us. The air became stifling, and our headlamps began to flicker. In the darkness, every rock and shadow could have been that thing, and every heartbeat felt like a drum announcing our presence. We came to a split in the tunnel. Derek went one way, Megan and I went the other, desperate to put distance between us and whatever had been following. The tunnel we took narrowed, forcing us to crawl on hands and knees. Water dripped steadily from above, pooling at our elbows, cold and filthy. I could hear faint laughter, or what I thought was laughter, from the direction Derek had gone. I don't know how long we crawled. Time lost meaning. The darkness was absolute, oppressive. My flashlight's battery died, leaving us in near pitch black. Megan's sobs were quiet, restrained, but they cut through the silence like a knife. I reached out blindly, trying to find the wall or a ledge, anything that could guide us. That's when I felt it. A brush against my shoulder. Something cold, slimy, impossibly fast. I froze, heart hammering, praying it hadn't felt my presence. Megan hissed, clutching me tightly. Then the whispering returned, all around us now. I realized it was coming from the walls, or perhaps from the cave itself. It was impossible to tell. The sound was inhuman, alien, like thousands of voices layered into one. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the darkness made my throat dry and useless. Eventually, we emerged into a small cavern, faint light trickling down from a crack above. It was the first real glimpse of the outside since we'd gone in. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. Derek wasn't there. Only our gear remained, scattered in a corner. I called his name, my voice echoing weakly. Nothing answered except the whispers. We climbed toward the faint light, our hands bloody and scraped from the rock. The exit was narrow, almost impossibly so. But we forced ourselves through, feeling the weight of hours underground pressing on us. When we finally emerged, the sky was gray, and the sun had begun to set. Our clothes were ruined, soaked and muddy, and our bodies ached from the crawl. Megan collapsed on the ground, shaking uncontrollably. I looked back at the cave entrance. It was silent now, no whispers, no movement. Only the dark maw of stone that had swallowed Derek. We never found him. Rescue teams searched for days, but the cave was treacherous and unmapped. Every expedition returned empty-handed, and locals avoided it, speaking in hushed tones about the spirits, or creatures, that lived below. I haven't gone caving since, but the memories haunt me. Sometimes at night, I hear faint whispers, soft and close, like the sound of wet rock scraping in the dark. I know it's impossible, that the cave is miles away, yet the fear never leaves. I keep thinking about Derek, about what we didn't see, about the eyes in the dark that watched us, and I wonder if someday when I'm not looking, it will come for me too. Story the end. The limestone cliffs of Kentucky were notorious among cavers. Deep, twisting networks of caves stretched beneath the earth, some mapped, many not. It was the allure of the unknown that drew us. 5 friends with a shared obsession, all of us in our mid-20s, flush with the arrogance of youth and the false confidence that comes with being well prepared. We had explored countless caves before, survived every scrape, every misstep. But this time, things would be different. We arrived at the entrance of Devil's Hollow on a late October morning. The air was damp and smelled of decayed leaves, earthy and sharp. The sky overhead was a muted gray, threatening rain. None of us mentioned the uneasy feeling that crept up our spines as we parked the van, geared up, and double-checked our ropes and helmets. Our leader, Jason, was always the boldest. He grinned at us, flashlight in hand, as if daring the cave to resist him. "You ready to go where no one's been?" he asked. His voice echoed slightly in the narrow mouth of the cavern. We nodded, eager and nervous. The others, Mark, Sarah, and Kevin, followed closely behind. I was last, tightening my harness, taking in the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally behind the jagged entrance. The first hour was nothing unusual. Stalactites hung like teeth above us. Water trickled down walls slick with moss and limestone deposits. Our lights cut through the darkness in halos, revealing twisting passages and sudden drops. Laughter and chatter echoed off the stone. We were explorers, thrill-seekers, and nothing had ever truly scared us before. But then we reached a narrow squeeze, a passage so tight we had to remove our backpacks. Jason went first, followed by Mark. Sarah hesitated, then slid through, grunting as she wriggled. When it was my turn, I felt it. The air suddenly thickened, as if the cave itself was holding its breath. My light caught on a wall streaked with black, wet, and glistening. I paused, suddenly aware of the silence behind me. No footsteps. I called out, expecting a reply. Nothing. Just the dripping of water somewhere deeper in the cave. Panic fluttered in my chest. I shone my light backward, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the walls. But the passage was too narrow for anyone to hide. Any shadow had to be mine. My rational mind tried to calm me, but my gut churned. I pressed on, squeezing through the passage, feeling the limestone scrape against my arms and legs. When I emerged, the passage opened into a small chamber. My relief was short-lived. The chamber was bigger than expected, maybe 30 feet across, but the air was colder, heavier. Jason's voice called from somewhere ahead. I hurried toward it, only to find the chamber empty. The ropes, our packs, everything was gone. I shouted again, "Jason, Mark, Sarah, Kevin!" My voice echoed and then disappeared. My light swung wildly across the walls, catching something that made me freeze. A smear of red smeared across the limestone like it had been dragged. My stomach knotted. I called again, more frantically this time, my voice cracking. There was no reply, only the slow, steady drip of water, and then faint, wet, scratching sounds from the ceiling above. I swung my light upward. Nothing moved at first. Then, just at the edge of my vision, something shifted. A shadow that wasn't cast by the stone formations. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart pounded. I backed toward the entrance of the chamber, looking for the passage we had come through. But the squeeze that had led us here seemed gone. The walls were now a solid, unbroken limestone. Panic fully set in. I called their names over and over, my voice raw, but nothing came back. I tried to retrace my steps, but every passage I remembered had shifted. The cave didn't feel like a cave anymore. It felt alive, hostile, and hungry. Hours passed, though I couldn't tell. The darkness pressed in, suffocating. I began to notice things, small things at first, rocks that weren't there before, tiny scratches along the walls, almost like fingernails, a low, wet sound that seemed to follow me no matter which passage I took. It wasn't echoing, it was moving with me. I tried to stay calm, rational. I told myself the others had gone ahead, maybe exploring, maybe hiding as a joke, but the scratches grew longer, fresher. The dripping sounds became louder, more deliberate. And then came the whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, curling through the darkness, calling my name. I spun around, light trembling, and saw nothing. By the time I realized I wasn't alone, I was already too deep. The cave had shifted again. Walls twisted in impossible angles. I turned a corner and found myself in a cavern filled with stalagmites like a forest of stone. My flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I saw them. Or it. Figures, thin, pale, with wet, glistening skin, crouched among the stalagmites. Their eyes caught the light for a moment, reflecting a yellow, predatory glow. Their hands were too long, fingers curling like claws. They moved with a sickening, jerky grace, as if they had never been meant to walk upright. I froze, heart in my throat. They didn't make a sound, just watched me. My first instinct was to run, but the cave shifted again, narrowing behind me. There was no escape. I stumbled forward, tripping over jagged stone, and they moved, silently, smoothly, keeping pace. The air reeked of decay and wet earth, and with each step I felt my strength drain. I screamed. They screamed back, not with voices, but a guttural, inhuman sound that reverberated through the stone, shaking the very ground. It was then I realized. The whispers, the scratches, the shifting passages, they weren't random. The cave itself was feeding them, guiding them. It was alive, and it hated us. I ran blindly, chest burning, lungs raw. Every turn led to new horrors, creatures crouched in shadows, hands stretching for me. I lost track of time. Days might have passed, minutes could have been years. I felt the cold seep into my bones, my skin scraping raw against the stone as I crawled, squeezed, and stumbled through twisting tunnels. And then, suddenly, I found myself in a familiar place. Or at least it felt familiar. A small chamber with a faint light coming from above. I climbed, hands bloody, fingers raw. At the opening, the outside world glimmered, a sky gray and dripping with rain. I scrambled out, collapsing onto wet leaves. But the relief was fleeting. When I turned to look back at the cave, I realized something horrifying. The entrance had vanished. The limestone cliffs were solid, unbroken. No cracks, no openings, nothing. The world I knew had swallowed the cave whole. I staggered through the forest for hours, eventually finding a dirt road. A passing car stopped, and I was taken in, shaking, covered in mud, blood, and something worse. Fear so deep it burrowed into my soul. I told my story to the authorities. They searched, of course. Nothing. No entrance, no friends, no sign anyone had ever been there. The local papers called it a lost cave legend, a spelunker's nightmare. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and sometimes at night I still hear the whispers calling my name just beyond the edge of sleep. I never go near caves anymore. I avoid the dark, the damp, the unknown. But I know it's out there, waiting. The cave and whatever it feeds will always remember me, and I can't shake the feeling that one day it will call me back. Story, the end. The wind cut across the ridges of the Appalachian Mountains that November morning, carrying with it the faint chill of early winter. A group of 5 friends, Ryan, Mark, Emily, Sarah, and Jason, had been planning this caving trip for months. They were all experienced hikers and amateur spelunkers, eager to explore a network of limestone caves in rural Kentucky that had a reputation among locals for being unwelcoming. Locals whispered about strange echoes, sudden rockfalls, and people who wandered too far and never returned. The stories only fueled their excitement. The cave entrance was an unassuming gash in the cliffside, partially concealed by thick vines and moss. Jason, the unofficial leader, checked their gear one last time: ropes, helmets, headlamps, extra batteries, and a handheld radio. The air around the mouth of the cave was cold and damp, carrying the metallic scent of wet stone. They stepped in, leaving behind the muted daylight for a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound. At first, the descent was exhilarating. Their headlamps illuminated jagged walls, dripping stalactites, and narrow passages that twisted in unpredictable directions. The group laughed as they ducked under rock formations, the echo of their voices bouncing back, distorted and eerie. But as they went deeper, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder and denser, and the silence outside their lights was oppressive. The further they went, the more they felt the cave itself watching them. About an hour in, Ryan led the way through a particularly tight passage, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. He felt the cold stone pressing against his shoulders, heard the faint scrape of his helmet echoing back. When he emerged into a larger chamber, he stopped short. The space was enormous, its ceiling lost in darkness above. Water pooled on the floor, reflecting their lights in broken, shimmering patterns. The walls were covered in streaks of reddish-brown like dried blood, though Ryan tried to rationalize it as mineral deposits. He motioned for the others to follow. Emily noticed something first, a faint scratching sound. At first, it seemed like their imagination, the acoustics of the cavern creating phantom noises from the dripping water. But then it became clearer. A deliberate, slow scratching coming from somewhere ahead, deeper in the chamber. Mark laughed nervously. "Probably some bats," he said, though his voice betrayed unease. As they moved closer to the source, Sarah froze. In the half-light, she thought she saw a figure crouched in the shadows, small and indistinct, as if it had been waiting for them. When they shone their lights, it was gone. The scratching stopped. A cold dread settled over them. They had been caving together for years, and none had ever felt such visceral fear. They pressed on, trying to rationalize what they saw. Jason suggested they take a different path that would loop them back to the entrance more directly. The group agreed, though a strange instinct warned Ryan against it. The narrow corridor they followed twisted downwards, and soon the air grew thick with an earthy, metallic scent, like wet clay and decay. Their radios crackled faintly, a garbled static that seemed almost deliberate. Then suddenly Emily screamed. Ryan spun around, shining his light. Emily had fallen into a small pit hidden by loose rocks. She was shaken but unhurt, her ankle scraped and bleeding slightly. They helped her out, but the incident shook them. Their nerves were fraying, the oppressive darkness weighing down their thoughts. Even Jason, normally confident and level-headed, muttered about turning back. That's when they noticed the markings on the walls. At first, Ryan thought they were natural scratches, but the pattern was deliberate, zigzags, circles, and crude symbols etched deep into the limestone. They didn't resemble anything known. Jason tried to take photos, but the camera battery died instantly, as if drained by the darkness itself. Then Sarah pointed ahead, voice trembling. A shadow moved across the wall. "Who's there?" Jason called. No answer. The shadow flickered again, independent of their lights. Panic set in. The group began to realize they weren't alone. The scratching resumed, closer this time, circling them. Every turn of the head seemed to reveal movement that wasn't there when they looked directly. Their lights flickered. Sarah swore she heard whispers, low and urgent, coming from the stone itself. They tried to retrace their path, but the cave seemed to shift. Passages that had been open before were blocked by new rock formations. The exit they remembered was gone. Jason checked his compass, completely useless. Their GPS had no signal. The cave was alive in a way they didn't understand, twisting and reshaping around them. Claustrophobia and fear gripped them in equal measure. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. Hunger and exhaustion were secondary to the terror. The group found a narrow ledge and huddled together, trying to conserve warmth and stay calm. That's when Mark vanished. 1 second he was adjusting his helmet, the next he was gone. Ryan shone his light, calling out frantically, but the passage ahead was empty. No rocks had shifted, no evidence of where he went. Just the lingering echo of his scream, swallowed almost instantly by the cavern. Panic overtook rational thought. Jason tried to lead the remaining 3 deeper into what he thought might be an exit, but the passages narrowed to barely more than a crawl space. Emily's light flickered and died. She screamed as something cold and wet brushed her arm. Ryan shone his lamp and saw nothing, but then Sarah whispered, trembling, "I saw it. Eyes, hundreds of them, staring from the walls." Their movements became erratic, desperate. The cave seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated in their bones. Shadows darted across every surface. Every step forward felt like being watched, pursued. They found themselves in a circular chamber, walls smooth and unnaturally polished. Symbols covered every inch. In the center, a shallow pool reflected their pale faces back at them, but the reflections were wrong. Twisted, elongated, mouths moving silently as if screaming. The air was thick, hard to breathe, and the scratching, now accompanied by faint, wet thuds, was all around them. Jason tried to call for help on the radio, but instead of static, a voice answered. It was faint, distorted, almost human. "Leave or stay forever?" It repeated over and over. The voice made no sense, but its malice was palpable. Emily screamed and tried to flee. The walls seemed to close in. The ground trembled. Ryan grabbed her arm, but a shadow swept past, dragging her into the darkness. He lunged, but there was nothing there. Just the echo of her scream bouncing off the walls. Ryan and Sarah, the last 2, backed into the shallow pool. The water rippled unnaturally, and he realized their reflections were moving independently. Then from the pool, shapes rose, dark, amorphous forms with glinting, insect-like eyes. They hissed and whispered in a language that made Ryan's blood run cold. Sarah screamed and tried to run, but the floor shifted like liquid beneath her feet, forcing her into the pool. Ryan grabbed her, screaming her name, but the water swallowed her instantly. Only his reflection remained, grinning with teeth he didn't have. He ran blindly, deeper into the maze, headlamp swinging wildly, the scratching and whispers chasing him. He saw a narrow shaft leading upwards. Without hesitation, he scrambled, fingers cutting into the stone. He emerged into a small chamber, heart pounding, lungs burning. In the dim light, he saw the remnants of the others, their backpacks, helmets, scattered along the floor, but no bodies, only shadows moving unnaturally, merging with the walls. Ryan realized he was alone. The cave was endless, a living nightmare. Every passage looked identical. He called out, but his voice was stolen by the cavern itself. Exhaustion and fear blurred reality. When he finally collapsed against a wall, he heard it. The faintest scratching just behind him, slow and deliberate, like fingernails tracing the stone. He turned, but nothing was there. The whispers returned, soft, beckoning, promising. Eternity. He tried to follow the faint sound of wind from above, thinking it might lead to an exit. Hours, or maybe days, passed. The cave had swallowed time itself. Food and water no longer mattered. His headlamp flickered and died. Complete darkness engulfed him, and the whispering grew louder, closer. Then, from the blackness, came the scraping sound, circling him, intimate and deliberate. He felt a presence, cold and impossible, wrapping around him. Ryan's last thought before surrendering to the cave's embrace was of the others. Trapped somewhere in its bowels, shadows among shadows, their voices now part of the whispers. He understood finally that the cave wasn't just a place, it was a predator. It moved, it watched, and it consumed. Outside, search teams would find no bodies, only empty equipment at the entrance, and the locals would shake their heads knowingly. The cave had claimed another group, just as it had claimed countless before, and it would wait patiently for the next curious souls. Story the end. The wind howled over the Appalachian ridges as I approached the mouth of the cave. The entrance was partially hidden by fallen trees and overgrown vines, and a cold draft swept out from the blackness within. I had been caving for years, but something about this particular system made my stomach tighten. Not the usual excitement. I've explored tight squeezes, slippery ledges, underground rivers, even lost my footing hundreds of feet underground before. But this place had a presence. It was old, and it felt like it was watching. I was joined by two friends, Jason and Carla, both experienced cavers like me. Jason carried the bulk of the gear, ropes, carabiners, a small first aid kit, while Carla had her camera rigged to capture 360-degree footage inside. Our plan was straightforward. A full-day exploration, documenting the untouched passages and any unusual formations, then retreat before nightfall. We'd studied the maps, watched the satellite topography, and talked to locals who warned us about collapses, sudden flooding, and more often than not, the old legends. People disappearing in these woods, swallowed whole by the earth. We joked about it to keep our nerves at bay. But I noticed even Jason, who usually laughed at every shadow, kept a tight expression. The first half-mile inside was familiar enough. Low ceilings, damp rock, the smell of wet stone and moss. I moved carefully, headlamp slicing through the darkness, illuminating the walls with faint quartz veins. The echo of dripping water made the cave feel alive, like it had lungs that drew you further inside. As we descended, I realized the temperature dropped sharply, and a strange metallic tang lingered in the air. Carla paused, shining her flashlight along the walls, and whispered, "It smells. Wrong." I nodded, but chalked it up to some mineral deposit or a stagnant underground pool. Jason didn't comment, but his jaw was tight. 2 hours in, we reached a fork. Left seemed shallow, a tight squeeze that disappeared into shadow, while right continued downward at a steeper angle. The maps indicated the right path led deeper into an uncharted section. We hesitated, a moment of silent debate. Carla was eager to explore the unknown. Jason looked at me, silently asking for approval. I gave a slight nod, and we went right. That decision would haunt me. The passage narrowed quickly. My shoulders scraped the walls, and every step stirred up fine dust that caught in my throat. We climbed over jagged rocks, careful to avoid loose surfaces. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled into a small chamber. The walls were slick with moisture, and the ceiling hung lower than expected. But what stopped me cold was the floor. The rock wasn't natural. Someone or something had carved grooves, lines etched deep into the stone, forming patterns that didn't make sense. At first, I thought they were cracks, but then I noticed faint stains in the grooves, reddish-brown like dried blood. My stomach churned. "We should leave," I said quietly. Jason frowned. "Probably just iron deposits," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Carla, ever the documentarian, had already started filming. We pressed onward. The chamber opened into a vertical shaft 50 feet down with rope anchors we hadn't installed. I ran my fingers along the metal bolts. They were old, rusted, possibly decades old. Someone had been here long before us. We descended carefully, ropes creaking under our weight. Halfway down, I heard it, a sound like a whisper, faint but unmistakable, bouncing off the walls. I froze. Jason paused, scanning the shadows with his light. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Carla shook her head. "Probably just the wind," she said, but even she sounded uncertain. We reached the bottom into a cavern so vast it swallowed our lights. The ceiling stretched into darkness, dripping water at irregular intervals. Stalactites and stalagmites formed natural corridors, and somewhere in the distance, a river of underground water gurgled. We were the first humans here in a long time, I realized. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. And then faintly, I heard it again, a whispering, like multiple voices just out of sync. My pulse jumped. Jason froze mid-step. Carla swung her camera toward the shadows, but the lens only caught blackness. "Okay," I said, trying to steady my voice. "We explore a bit, then go back." The rational part of me insisted it was echo, wind, or trick of the acoustics, but the unease in my gut said otherwise. We moved cautiously, following the river's edge. The whispering grew louder, more deliberate. At first, I thought it was the wind through small cracks, but then I realized it was forming words. Not English, not any language I recognized, a soft chanting that sounded almost human, but wrong, distorted. Carla panicked first. "Let's get out of here," she shouted, but as she turned, she froze. I followed her gaze. Shadows were moving along the walls, not ours, not our lights. Something else, slender humanoid shapes darting between stalagmites. They didn't run. They glided, silently, without breaking the reflection of our lights. I could barely make out faces, elongated, pale, with empty eye sockets. The air grew colder. My fingers went numb. Jason whispered, "Keep calm. Don't move too fast." I tried to backtrack, but the passage we came through was gone, or maybe we never recognized the right path. The cavern seemed to shift, the shadows moving just out of line with our steps. Panic set in. Carla dropped her camera. It shattered against the stone. The whispering became a chorus, a rising tide of hissing voices that filled the chamber, echoing endlessly. I could feel it inside my head, like it was pressing against my skull, vibrating, trying to make me listen. Jason grabbed my arm. "We need to climb," he hissed, pointing to a narrow passage that seemed new, not on our maps. We scrambled through, hands on slick rock, the air thick with dust and fear. Somewhere behind us, the shadows followed, sliding along the walls. I kept my head down, focusing on the climb, but I could hear them moving, just a heartbeat behind. At one point, my foot slipped. I slammed against the rock, gasping. I glanced back. The shadows stopped, a frozen tableau, then melted into the darkness. After what felt like hours, we reached another chamber. It was smaller, claustrophobic, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. Then I saw it. Markings on the walls, deep scratches like claws, the shapes of faces etched into stone, twisted in silent screams, and below them something that made my stomach knot. Footprints. Not ours, too small to be human, some even overlapping, as if dozens of creatures had passed here. I realized the whispers weren't coming from far away. They were all around us, inside the walls, maybe inside us. Jason found a narrow climb back upward. We moved quickly, frantically, slipping in mud and water. The whispering followed, now overlapping with shrill, screeching sounds, high-pitched, almost like birds but distorted. I lost track of how many times I slipped, hit the walls, clawed at the rock. Carla screamed once, swallowed by a black alcove, and I thought I had lost her. Then she emerged, pale, wide, her voice broken. "Don't look at them," she gasped. Finally, we spotted faint daylight. The cave entrance, smaller than I remembered, partially blocked by rock and roots. We scrambled out, coughing, my lungs burning, sunlight blinding us. We didn't speak. The wind outside felt like a blessing, ordinary and neutral. We made it back to our vehicle, packed hastily, leaving behind gear, camera, and ropes. Jason's hands shook as he drove us down the mountain. We didn't stop until the forest and ridges were miles behind us. I thought about calling authorities, telling someone what we'd seen. But what would I say? Creatures, whispers, ancient carvings? I still can't explain what happened. I haven't returned, and I won't. The cave is still there, somewhere under the ridges, waiting. Some nights I can hear the whispers in my dreams like they never left. Like the shadows are still inside me, patient and hungry. Story the end.